Hey guys, welcome back to the Red Bed. Today I've got a longer video for you, packed with real-life Reddit stories that will help you unwind, fall asleep, or just have running in the background. For the first couple of hours, you'll be hearing brand new stories I haven't shared before. And then the last hour will feature some of my favorite older ones that you might have missed the first time around. Most of these are about entitled people and the wild ways others deal with them. And trust me, some of them get pretty ridiculous. And I try to get these videos out daily, so if you're enjoying them, make sure to subscribe. But now sit back, relax, and enjoy as I continue my journey in this hardcore world with my friends. This first story is about a woman who tried to snatch another customer's face mask for her child and ended up getting tasered in the middle of a crowded store. So my husband and I had gone out to one of those big box stores, just trying to grab some potting soil. We had this plan to keep ourselves busy at home with some gardening projects, so we were loading up different types of soil. The store had a 2 per customer limit on most items, so we figured the best way to do it was to each grab 2 bags of each type. My husband was stacking them onto the cart when I suddenly heard this voice. Sharp, loud, and full of outrage. You know, the kind that makes your stomach drop because you already know some drama is about to unfold. I turned and, sure enough, there she was. A mom with her kid tugging at her arm, pointing directly at us. She didn't even have the classic Karen haircut people joke about. She looked more like a tired mom with way too much in her basket. But her attitude gave her away instantly. She started shouting that we were hoarding, claiming we couldn't possibly buy that many bags. My husband calmly told her we were following the rules, that we were only taking 2 each. She wasn't having it. She huffed, dragged her kid back inside, and started yelling to the employee at the register that we were stealing dirt of all things. We didn't think much of it, finished loading our car, and then went back to return the cart and look at some plants. That's when things got even stranger. Now she was in line, trying to cut ahead of people. She was doing that guilt trip routine, saying her basket was too heavy and she had a child with her, so couldn't someone just let her slide to the front? The young woman she was trying to cut in front of wasn't having it. This girl was wearing a black neck gator mask with wolf teeth printed on it, and honestly, even though she was in flip-flops and a casual t-shirt, the mask alone gave her this don't mess with me vibe. She just shook her head no, calm but firm. But the mom, let's just call her Karen, wasn't ready to quit. She switched tactics, focusing on the mask itself. She told the young woman she didn't even need it anymore since she was leaving, and that her son could get sick if she didn't give it to him. Then she took it a step further, saying it was obviously made for boys, and that the girl shouldn't even want it. Mask Girl just shot back that she wasn't giving it up, that it was hers, and reminded her that it had her germs on it. That should have been the end, but Karen took it to another level. As the mask girl tried to walk away, Karen actually reached out and grabbed the back of her mask, yanking it. The whole store seemed to freeze in that moment. You could hear people around me gasp, and I swear it felt like everything went into high definition, like my brain knew something wild was about to happen, and then it did. The next second, there was this loud crack, almost like a snapping sound, and Karen went down to the floor hard. Mask Girl had pulled out this little taser, it looked almost like a flashlight, and zapped her. Karen immediately started writhing and screaming on the ground, while her kid burst into tears, shouting that the wolf girl killed his mom. Meanwhile, the rest of us were just standing there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Then chaos broke loose. Employees came rushing over, a security guard appeared, and everyone in line started talking at once, trying to explain. Some people were laughing nervously, others looked horrified, and Karen herself started demanding everything under the sun. An ambulance, the police, even the mayor. She was groaning, crying, and clutching her side while her kid tried to shake her awake, even though she was very much conscious. The crazy part? Mask Girl was completely calm, like she had expected this kind of nonsense before. She stood there, waiting while the security guard got the story from witnesses. The employees already seemed to know who was at fault, because everyone had seen Karen grab her first. At that point, my husband gave me the look. The, let's get out of here before this gets any messier look. He quietly put the plants we had picked out back onto a shelf, and we walked straight out the door. Nobody stopped us, and honestly, I think the employees were relieved a couple people chose to leave before things escalated further. The whole drive home, we didn't say a word. It was like we were both replaying the scene in our heads. But the second we parked in the driveway, we just burst out laughing at the absurdity of it all. We live in this mellow little beach town where people are usually laid back and friendly. Seeing someone get tasered over a mask in the middle of a garden center felt like we had stepped into another reality. That's the end of this story. That whole situation sounds like it came straight out of a movie. You don't expect to see someone go from complaining about soil to getting tasered in front of a checkout line. What really stood out to me was how calm the masked girl was the entire time, even after it all went down. Almost like she had dealt with people like that before and wasn't fazed. And the fact that Karen demanded an ambulance, the police, and even the mayor just makes the whole thing even more surreal. It's one of those moments where, afterward, you just sit there realizing you've got a story you'll never forget. This next story is about a cancer patient coming home from chemotherapy who was harassed by an entitled mom, demanding he give up his bus seat, only for the situation to take an unbelievable turn. This happened about 7 months ago, back when I was right in the middle of chemotherapy treatments for a tumor in my nasal cavity. It was stage 2, and while the tumor was large, the doctors told me it was still contained, which meant it hadn't spread. That gave me some hope, but the treatments themselves were brutal. The chemo left me completely drained, and the side effects hit hard. My hair started falling out in clumps, my eyebrows and eyelashes disappeared, and eventually I had to shave my head completely bald. To make things less awkward in public, I wore a wig. The main reason wasn't vanity. I'm 6'4", pretty muscular, and without hair I thought I looked like I could be mistaken for some kind of skinhead. I didn't want strangers jumping to the wrong conclusion about me, so the wig just felt easier. One afternoon, after a particularly rough chemo session, I dragged myself to the bus stop. There's only one line that goes from the hospital to my area, and when it pulled up, my heart sank. It was packed to the brim. Every seat was taken. People were standing shoulder to shoulder, and I was already fighting waves of nausea from the treatment. Standing for a 40-minute ride home was the last thing I needed. I spotted a middle-aged man sitting near the front and asked him quietly if he'd mind letting me sit. The second he looked at me, he seemed to understand. Without a single complaint, he stood and offered me his spot. I still remember the relief I felt lowering myself onto that seat. If you're out there listening, man, thank you again. 2 stops later, in Storm's Trouble, a woman gets on with her kid. She had that unmistakable entitled presence. She started bulldozing her way through the aisle, huffing and puffing, her eyes darting around like she was scanning for prey. And then her gaze locked on me. She marched straight over, practically dragging her son behind her, and stopped in front of my seat. "Could you let my kid sit down?" she asked in this sharp, expectant tone. I looked up, tired but polite, and said, "I'm sorry, but I just came from the hospital and..." She cut me off before I could even finish. So did we. My boy just broke his leg, and we're coming straight from the emergency room. I glanced at the kid. He was standing on both feet, no crutches, no cast, no limp. He actually looked embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably as his mom kept going. She leaned in closer. "Look here, boy," she snapped, even though I was 21 at the time. "My kid deserves this seat." At that point, I was exhausted and didn't want a scene. So I tried again, a little firmer this time. "Look, I'm sorry, but I just got out of a chemo session and I really need to sit down." To drive the point home, I adjusted my wig just enough so she could clearly see my bald scalp. That should have been the end of it. Any decent person would have realized what was going on and backed off. But not this woman. Instead, she exploded. She started yelling at me, accusing me of making excuses, and then shouted loud enough for the whole bus to hear, "Get off the seat, you skinhead." I was stunned. I didn't even know how to respond. People around us were staring. Her son was tugging at her sleeve, clearly mortified, whispering for her to stop. And then, unbelievably, she grabbed me by the arm and tried to yank me out of the seat. That's when another passenger, an older gentleman sitting a few rows back, stood up. He had this calm, steady voice that cut right through her screaming. "Will you shut up and leave him alone already?" he barked. She whirled on him, furious, demanding, "Who do you think you're talking to?" The old man didn't even flinch. He just said, "Everyone can see this guy has cancer. Stop harassing him." She sneered back, "No, he's just a skinhead." And then the old man dropped a line that silenced the entire bus. "He's got no eyebrows, you twit." The whole bus froze. People gasped, and she must have felt cornered because instead of backing down, she swung her fist and punched the old man square in the face. That was the last mistake she made. The man calmly reached into his jacket, pulled out a badge, and said in an ice-cold voice, "Harassing passengers, assaulting me, and now hitting an officer? You're in deep trouble, lady." Turns out the man was an undercover cop. He pulled out his phone, called for backup, and told her to sit tight. She turned pale as a sheet, but when the bus stopped a few minutes later, she tried to make a run for it. Unfortunately for her, the other passengers weren't having it. They blocked her path and kept her trapped until police arrived 3 stops later. Her kid actually apologized to me, and I genuinely felt bad for him. None of this was his fault. His mom was the one causing chaos, and he was just caught in the middle. In the end, she was arrested for harassment, resisting, and assault. Later, I pressed charges. From what I heard, she ended up with a few months in jail and community service. As for me, I eventually finished treatment. The surgery went well, and a few months after that, I was declared cancer-free. My hair has started growing back, and I don't need to wear the wig anymore. But that day on the bus, that'll always stick with me as one of the wildest encounters of my life. That's the end of this story. The way that whole situation unfolded was just unbelievable. One moment it's chaos with her screaming, and the next the entire bus is dead quiet when the old guy calls her out. What stood out most to me was actually the kid. You could tell he was embarrassed and wanted nothing to do with it, which makes it even sadder that he was stuck in that mess. The line about the eyebrows cracked me up though, because it was so blunt but spot on. And then seeing her try to fight back only to realize she was swinging at an undercover cop, that's about as instant as karma gets. This next story is about a blind woman who was shopping alone when an entitled mom let her kid steal her cane, leaving her completely stranded. So here's the backstory. I'm 28 now, and I've only been completely blind for about a year. When I was younger, I volunteered with my local youth group to help rebuild Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina. While I was down there, I picked up a fungal parasite called histoplasmosis. Over the years, it spread and eventually reached my eyes, slowly robbing me of my sight. By the time it was fully gone, I had no support group, no training, and no idea how to adjust. At first, I was scared to even leave the house. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like everyone was staring. And honestly, I didn't even know how to move around properly without crashing into things. But one day, my husband asked if I could take an Uber to the bank and deposit a rent check. It was a simple errand, so I agreed. While I was out, he messaged me again, reminding me that we were out of groceries. Conveniently, there was a Walmart grocery store right across the street from the bank. I figured at some point I had to learn how to shop on my own, so I decided to give it a try. At first, everything was fine. I only needed a few things, so I didn't grab a cart. I had my cane in hand and was relying on what little echolocation skills I had at the time. I still bumped into shelves and displays here and there, but that's just part of learning. Then, all of a sudden, my cane tapped something softer than a display. I instantly worried I had hit a person. I started to apologize, but before I could finish, I heard a woman's sharp voice. It was an entitled mother, and apparently I had bumped her son. I immediately said I was sorry, but she shot back that I should have seen him. I calmly explained that I couldn't see him because I was blind, which is exactly why I had my cane. Instead of understanding, she asked why I wasn't wearing dark sunglasses if I was really blind. I tried to tell her that those are expensive and that I didn't need them indoors, but she cut me off and accused me of faking. And then it escalated. In the middle of her rant, I felt a sudden tug, and before I could even react, her kid yanked my cane right out of my hands. To anyone who isn't blind, that might not sound like a big deal, but to me, it's like someone cut the power in the middle of a pitch-black night. I froze. My heart started racing, and I could feel myself slipping into panic. I begged her to give it back, but she said her son deserved it more, and let him walk away with it, bumping into shelves as he went. I started crying, spinning in place with my arms out, desperate to grab onto something for balance. I stumbled into a display, crashing into it and knocking things over, which just made more noise and attention. I wanted to curl into a ball and disappear. For a moment, I felt completely helpless. Then I felt a large hand gently touch my shoulder. A man's voice, calm but strong, told me to stay put, that he'd take care of it. His footsteps were heavy, and I could hear him striding away with purpose. A moment later, I heard a loud crash and what sounded like a deep roar of anger. The next thing I knew, He was back, placing my cane carefully in my hand. I gripped it like my life depended on it. I wiped away tears, thanking him over and over, and he simply said not to worry, that some people were just monsters. He stayed with me, even helping me pick up the things I'd dropped and guiding me through the rest of my shopping. As we walked out of the store together, I could still hear the entitled mom screeching somewhere in the background, yelling about how he had pulled the cane away so hard that her kid got knocked into a cart. I don't know if she exaggerated, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised given the crash I heard earlier. In that terrifying moment, I had felt so small and so alone, but this stranger stepped in when I needed it most, and it reminded me that even when the world feels impossible without sight, there are still good people out there willing to stand up for me. That's the end of this story. That whole scene is wild to picture, but what really stuck with me was the contrast. The mom being completely heartless, and then this random guy stepping up like it was nothing. The way she dismissed blindness and even encouraged her kid to steal a cane, that just blows my mind. The part that hit me hardest was how quickly things went from manageable to terrifying the second the cane was gone. It's easy to forget how much independence relies on something so simple until it's stripped away. And honestly, I respect the stranger for not just helping quietly, but making sure she knew her behavior wasn't going unnoticed. It's moments like that that make you realize not everyone out there is awful. This next story is about a teacher on a school camping trip who got yelled at by an entitled mom for wearing a tank top in the heat because she thought it would distract her son. I've been student teaching for a 6th grade class this spring, and it's been a pretty intense but rewarding semester. From the very first day, my cooperating teacher and the rest of the grade level team treated me like a colleague, not just some extra body in the room. Even though I still look younger than I am, I've got one of those baby faces. The students respect me because I've worked with them a lot before. I subbed for them last year and this past fall too, so we already had a solid relationship. By the time the camping trip rolled around, I had officially finished my student teaching, but my teacher invited me to come along for the experience. The job was pretty relaxed compared to the regular classroom grind. Most of what we did was hang out in the medical lodge, making sure kids got their medications each day. After months of lesson planning and classroom management, it was nice to just be present with the students without all the stress. Now, the camp itself was hot, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the kids were in shorts and tank tops, which the camp dress code allowed. I was dressed in jeans, a black undershirt, and a tank top with wide straps that fully covered me. The only thing visible was the undershirt beneath it. It was comfortable, appropriate, and honestly, just practical for the weather. Not long after arriving, I stopped to fill up my water bottle before heading to the lodge with the other teachers. That's when I heard a sharp voice behind me. "You can't wear that." At first I thought maybe I misunderstood. I turned and smiled, ready to greet whoever it was. But instead I found an angry mom glaring at me. She launched into this lecture about how inappropriate my outfit was and how I was going to distract her son and all the boys. She even told me I'd need to change as soon as we reached the cabins. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just a misunderstanding, but that only made her angrier. She accused me of dressing to get the boys' attention and demanded to know who my teacher was so she could get me sent home. That's when I calmly asked whose parent she was. She named her son, a kid from another class who had a reputation for being a troublemaker, and I explained that I wasn't a student at all. I told her I was a teacher and that tank tops were perfectly allowed under the camp dress code. She didn't believe me. She said I was lying and kept insisting she was going to report me. Right then, one of the other teachers, Mrs. A, walked over. She was also wearing a tank top, by the way. I told her I was just introducing myself to this parent, and Mrs. A immediately backed me up. She explained to the mom that I had been an asset to the entire team that year, and had even taught a few science lessons to her son. She told her that I was on track to be a great teacher. The mom's face turned bright red, but she didn't say much after that. Later, when we had the parent meeting in the lodge, my cooperating teacher introduced me formally to all the parents. Most of them were warm and welcoming, even telling me how much their kids enjoyed having me as a teacher. The cherry on top came at dinner. Her son, right in front of her, ran up to me and asked if I could teach 7th grade next year so he could have me again. He said he was going to miss me, and you could tell that comment stung his mom more than anything else that day. That's where the story ends. I think what makes this story stand out is just how quickly the mom jumped to conclusions without even considering she might be wrong. Like, She saw a tank top and immediately decided it was a scandal. What really made me laugh was how another teacher showed up in the exact same type of outfit, and suddenly the whole argument fell apart. The son asking to have her as a teacher again was probably the most satisfying moment, though. It's just funny how kids tend to see things more clearly than some adults do. And honestly, you can just feel how awkward that must have been for the mom when it happened right in front of her. This next story is about a dad at the park who tried to kick other families out, claiming he rented the entire playground for his kids' party. So I had taken my kids to one of our usual city parks, a place we'd been to many times before. There's this one shady spot with a rocky hill, trees all around, and a playground sitting right next to a pavilion. It's usually a nice area where the kids can run around and play, while parents relax on the benches. When we got there that day, though, I noticed something was different right away. There were loud machines running, cables stretched across the ground, and extension cords lying everywhere. It turned out someone had rented the pavilion and set up 3 giant bounce houses all around it. Of course, my kids' eyes lit up the second they saw them, but I had to explain that those bounce houses were part of a private party, so they couldn't go on them. They were a little disappointed, but I told them the playground itself was still open and fair game. They ran off to climb on the pirate ship playset while I sat down on a bench nearby. Not long after, I heard someone yell, "Hey!" I looked up and saw this guy stomping toward me, trying his best to look tough. He had that over-the-top attitude, like someone out of a reality show. He told me the playground was closed for a private party, and that my kids had to leave. I calmly explained that public parks don't close for private parties. I pointed out that he clearly rented the pavilion, which was fine, but the playground wasn't part of that deal. He didn't like that answer one bit. He stormed off, came back waving a rental agreement in my face, and told me to take my kids and go. I looked at it. The agreement clearly said pavilion rental for $35. I mean, who honestly thinks $35 gets them exclusive use of an entire public playground? I told him again that we wouldn't touch his bounce houses or enter the pavilion, but the playground was open to everyone. That set him off even more, and he started throwing threats around. At that point, I considered packing up to avoid a scene, but I decided this wasn't the kind of thing to back down from. So I pulled out my phone and called the park office. During the summer, they staff rangers who are actual peace officers. I explained the situation, and they said they'd send someone right away. Before the ranger even arrived, the guy came back with 2 of his buddies, trying to intimidate me. They got in my face. One of them even grabbed my arm. And I told them flat out, if they touched me again, I'd call the cops and press charges. That made one of his friends back off instantly, but the ringleader kept pushing it until the ranger pulled up. The ranger came over, told everyone to step back, and the guy shoved his rental agreement into the ranger's chest, claiming I was trespassing. The ranger read it and immediately shut him down. He said, "This is for the pavilion. The playground is public." Then he noticed the bounce houses and asked where they were getting power from. We all followed the extension cords and saw they were plugged into the public bathroom outlet, which had a lock on it. The ranger held up the lock that had clearly been cut. When he asked the guy if he'd cut it, the guy tried to play dumb, saying it was already like that. The ranger wasn't buying it for a second. In the end, the ranger let the party continue so the kids wouldn't be disappointed, but he wrote the dad a citation for cutting the lock and illegally using power. He also banned him from the park for the rest of the season, though he let them finish out the party first. Meanwhile, my kids barely noticed any of this because the compressors from the bounce houses were so loud they drowned everything else out. To them, it was just another normal play day. That's the end of this story. The funniest part to me is how this guy really believed a $35 rental gave him authority over an entire park. Like, he was out there acting like a mob boss over a pavilion. The fact that one of his own friends didn't want the cops involved makes me think they knew exactly how shaky their ground was. What made me laugh was the ranger pulling out that broken lock, that moment where all the guys bluffing just collapsed. And honestly, the best part is the kids didn't even notice any of the drama. Sometimes that's the silver lining. The adults are losing it, and the kids are just happily playing like nothing happened. This next story is about a family dinner where an aunt tried to control everyone's orders, even down to the bread basket, and things quickly turned into a battle over who actually got to eat. This took place nearly 40 years ago, back when I was around 12. We were in town for a relative's funeral, and my entitled aunt, let's call her CA, insisted the whole family go out to her favorite Italian restaurant. According to her, it was the absolute best, and she was never wrong about such things. The restaurant had a little gimmick, a small Italian flag on every table. If you raised the flag, they brought you fresh rolls. Flag down, no rolls. Seemed simple enough, but that flag ended up playing a huge role in the night. So there we were, 6 of us seated, and already things got off to a rough start with the drink order. My dad asked for a Coke, my mom wanted a Coke, and I asked for tea with no sugar. Apparently, that was a mortal sin in the South. CA cut me off and said I couldn't possibly mean that, and insisted the waitress bring me sweet tea anyway. When my uncle tried to order a Coke too, she overruled him, telling the waitress that the whole family only drank sweet tea. Thankfully, the waitress was kind enough to ignore her and brought us what we actually wanted. But CA wasn't about to stop there. She tried to dictate our food orders as well. She demanded everyone get veal because, according to her, it was the best dish. The problem was I refused to eat veal. I had already explained to my parents years earlier why I wouldn't touch it, so they backed me up and ordered something else. My mom chose her own meal, I ordered lasagna, and to our surprise, my uncle found his courage and said he wanted something different too. That's when the real fireworks began. She argued with him like it was life or death. "You're getting the veal," she snapped. He calmly repeated that he wanted lasagna. She insisted he didn't know what he was talking about, that he only ever liked Italian food because she told him so. He shot back that he didn't even like Italian food, and that the only reason he always ordered veal in the past was because she forced him to. It was like watching a tennis match, her voice getting shriller with every sentence, while he just kept standing his ground. Even their daughter chimed in and ordered lasagna, only for CA to loudly announce that her child was allergic and couldn't possibly eat it. The poor girl had to correct her own mother in front of everyone. When the food arrived, we all got exactly what we wanted, much to CA's outrage. That's when the battle over the breadbasket began. My uncle raised the flag, she slammed it down. He put it back up, she yanked it down. Back and forth, while the bread server hovered nearby like he was waiting for the green light. Finally, the flag stayed up long enough, and fresh rolls landed on the table. CA immediately grabbed the basket and hurled it at the poor bread boy. But my uncle wasn't giving up that easily. Every time she told him he couldn't have bread, he pushed back harder. At one point, she tried to justify it by saying he wouldn't be hungry if he just ordered the veal. The whole restaurant started watching, clearly entertained, and even neighboring tables joined in. A kind woman slipped their basket of rolls to my cousin, who passed one to me, then to my dad, then to my mom, and finally onto my uncle's plate. CA lunged for it, but he was quicker and shoved the entire roll into his mouth at once, chewing victoriously while she fumed. By dessert, she was still trying to shut things down. She demanded the check, but the rest of us started ordering cake and pie. My mom even ordered cheesecake for CA just to twist the knife. She lost it, yelling that she was leaving without us. My dad just reminded her that he drove and she wasn't getting the keys. That sparked a whole new fight about who should drive the car. She claimed she was the better driver, despite the fact she once drove the wrong way on the freeway and got lost in her own neighborhood. By the time dessert was finished, she was still arguing, and kept it up the entire ride home. That's where the story ends. What cracks me up is how something as small as a breadbasket turned into an all-out battle. The flag going up and down like a tug-of-war must have looked ridiculous to everyone watching. I think the funniest part is how calm the rest of the family seemed, just quietly eating rolls while she shrieked across the table. And the car argument at the end was the perfect finishing touch. Imagine trying to convince everyone else that it's the other cars going the wrong way on the freeway. That's the kind of logic you just can't make up. This next story is about a parent who secretly filmed a coach jogging and then tried to use the video to get them in trouble at work. Not long ago, I had to have an emergency appendectomy. The surgery itself went fine, but the recovery was rough. I had to take time off not only from my own training, but also from the kids' sports program where I coach. That was honestly the hardest part because so much of my identity is tied up in being active and being out on the field. Suddenly, I couldn't do what I used to, and that left me feeling lost. When I finally got cleared by my doctor to start easing back into exercise, I was nervous. Every time I thought about running, I kept hearing my own inner voice saying, "You used to be faster," or "You used to be stronger," or "You don't belong out there anymore." It took me a while to push past that. Eventually, I decided I just had to get back out there. even if it meant starting slow and rebuilding from scratch. So I began going to the local track. At first, it was just a few slow laps in the morning. Nothing crazy. I'd put in my headphones, zone out, and remind myself that progress takes time. After a while, I added in some short sprints and light bodyweight training, just focusing on movement rather than performance. Most of the time, I didn't even notice who else was around me. I was too locked into keeping myself calm and steady. But apparently, someone else was noticing. And worse, they were recording me. On Friday, I showed up for practice like usual. The head coach asked me to step into his office because a parent had filed a complaint. I figured it was something minor, maybe about playing time or positions, like most parent complaints. Instead, when I walked in, I saw Karen, a parent I barely knew, sitting there with her phone in her hand. Without much preamble, she started playing a video she'd secretly recorded of me jogging on the track. I cannot even describe how uncomfortable it felt seeing myself on that screen. I wasn't sprinting, I wasn't pushing myself. I was just moving at a slow, steady pace, trying to rebuild. But she had filmed it from the stands, zoomed in, and was now showing it to my boss as if it were evidence of some crime. She immediately started pointing out that her 8-year-old son had lapped me in the video, and she insisted that coaches should be fitter than the kids they're training. She said if we wanted to prepare them for serious competition one day, then the coaches should be setting the standard. My boss stayed calm and explained that coaching is about teaching skills, building discipline, and guiding kids, not about proving you can outrun children. But she kept pushing. Then she made it personal. She claimed that me being out of shape must be connected to why I'd been taking time off, and said it wasn't good for the kids to have that kind of inconsistency. At that point, I decided maybe honesty would help. I explained I'd had surgery, that I was still recovering, and that I was cleared to train at the level I was doing. Instead of showing empathy, she turned to my boss and flat out said, "Well, maybe you should furlough her until she's healed and bring on a healthy coach in the meantime. My son needs someone who can keep up with him." That comment stung, but my boss didn't let her get away with it. He reminded her again that staff management was the responsibility of the program, not the parents. He said my personal health wasn't her business, and what mattered was that I was one of the most skilled in the area I taught. She tried asking if she could escalate it to someone higher up, but he calmly told her there was no higher up. He was the founder and the owner of the program. When she realized she wasn't going to get her way, she started fussing even louder, complaining that she was dissatisfied and wouldn't be recommending the program to anyone else. But my boss cut her off with a warning. He told her clearly, if she was ever caught surveilling staff or harassing them again, she would be permanently banned. That meant no games, no practices, no team events, no exceptions. She stormed out after that, but honestly, the most surreal part was how normal practice felt afterwards. The kids were happy, we had a good session, and life went on. I was still rattled by the idea of being secretly recorded. That thought will probably stick with me for a while. But at the same time, it was reassuring to know that my coworkers had my back. That's where the story ends. This one hit me because of how personal it got. Imagine working hard just to recover, and then someone decides to turn that into ammunition against you. The part that surprised me most was how casual she was about filming and showing it. Like, that was a totally normal thing to do. The boss handled it really well though, setting firm boundaries and not letting her push the issue any further. And honestly, it says a lot that while she was ranting about her son's future, the rest of the team was just focused on having a good practice. That contrast kind of says everything. This next story is about a neighbor who thought someone's backyard pool and property were basically a public park for her kids. When my partner and I bought our house, it was right next door to my best friend. I lived with him for years before, when his kids were just babies. So by the time we moved in, those kids saw my place as an extension of their own. They'd run in and out without knocking, play in the pool, or hang out in the yard like it was their second home. Since I was around more often than my friend and his wife, I'd usually be the one watching them in the mornings, after school, or on long weekends. Because his kids were still small, I installed a retractable pool cover with a lock on it, just to make sure they couldn't get into the water unsupervised. Between their yard, with the big wooden playset, sandbox, and swings, and my place with the pool, the kids had everything they needed. Evenings often meant barbecues, drinks, and watching them run around until it was dark. Then one summer afternoon, things got strange. I came home from work early, started prepping dinner, and heard a knock at my back door. That was unusual because my friend's kids never knocked. I opened it to find a woman I didn't recognize standing there with two kids around 5 to 7 years old. Before I could even say hello, she announced that her kids needed to use the bathroom and that I should unlock the pool for them because they were hot. I had to ask her to repeat herself because I thought I'd misheard, but she said it again, just as casually, like she had every right to be there. I asked why she was in my friend's yard and why she thought her kids could use my bathroom or swim in my pool. That's when she told me she had just moved into the house behind us, and she'd noticed how often my friend's kids came over. In her mind, if I opened my pool for them, then her kids should have the same access. I tried to explain the difference, that I'd basically helped raise my friend's kids, that I'd known them since birth, and that there was trust built up over years. But she didn't care. She brushed it off and said that I just needed to get to know her kids, and it would be fine. I told her no and closed the door. She didn't leave right away though. She banged on the door, yelled through the window, and eventually had her kids pee in one of my planters when I didn't react. Then, unbelievably, she marched them right back into my friend's yard so they could play on the swings. I texted him to let him know what was happening, right as he was letting his two massive Newfoundlands out into the yard. Between the barking and the sight of 300 pounds of dogs charging over, the woman panicked. She scrambled up into the fort, leaving her kids on the swings, and started screaming that he needed to put the dogs inside. She actually yelled at him for letting his own dogs out into his own yard while her kids were trespassing. He told her to get out and called the cops. When the police showed up, she went into full victim mode. She said her kids were just trying to make friends, that my buddy's kids were bullying them, and that he invited her over just so he could sick his dogs on her family. None of it made sense. The cops moved her back to her property and later told us she'd been warned not to come back. But the problems didn't stop. For almost a year, she kept sneaking in. I had to replace the lock on the pool cover controls 3 times. I even had to remove a gate in my fence that was meant just for the lawnmower because she used it to get in. Eventually, we hired a security company to check on the yard whenever we were away for more than a few hours. Over and over, we'd find her and her kids in the yard, but she'd always slip out when she knew we were home. The final straw came when my partner caught her actually in the pool with her kids. She tried to cover it up by saying she knew the man who owned the house and that he'd told her it was fine. My partner calmly told her he was married to the man who owned the pool, and it was definitely not fine. That was the first time she seemed to realize the pool wasn't some anonymous neighborhood amenity. It belonged to us. She didn't take it well and stormed off, muttering about how she didn't want her kids in gay water. After that day, we never saw her in the yard again. That's the end of this story. What gets me about this one is just how entitled she was from the start. Like, who knocks on a stranger's door and demands access to their pool and bathroom? The way she doubled down, even after being told no, just shows how little respect she had for boundaries. The part that made me laugh, though, was her reaction when she finally realized the pool belonged to a married couple. It's wild what people will convince themselves of. Honestly, I'm just impressed the family managed to put up with it as long as they did without losing their minds. This next story is about a woman who couldn't handle hearing another language in public and ended up embarrassing herself in a hilarious way. This happened a few months back around Christmas. I was home from college, visiting my dad and stepmom, and we decided to head to the mall together. My stepmom is Welsh, raised in England, and she grew up bilingual, speaking both Welsh and English because her parents wanted her and her brother to stay connected to their heritage. By the time she met my dad years later, she'd already built a solid career, moved to the US for work, and somehow managed to win my respect even when I was still grieving my mom. Over time, she became like a second mother to me. She's got this mix of warmth and sharp wit that makes her impossible not to love. So here we are in the mall, me, my stepmom, and my girlfriend Charlie, looking for a hobby store because my dad needed glue for one of his Warhammer projects. While we were checking the big mall directory, my stepmom was chatting on the phone with her brother back in the UK. They were speaking in Welsh, catching up, laughing. Nothing unusual. That's when I heard this loud scoff behind us. I turned to see a woman in a business suit, steering her kids away like we'd done something offensive. At first I ignored it, but Charlie, who's protective to a fault, decided to call her out. She asked, "Something offend you, ma'am?" And that's when the woman, let's just call her Karen, dropped a line that still makes my brain short circuit. "You're in America. When you're here, you speak English, not Muslim. My kids don't need to hear that." Now, I've heard some ridiculous takes in my life, but confusing Welsh with Arabic? That's a new one. Completely different languages, completely different cultures, but in her head, any language that wasn't English was apparently the same thing. My stepmom hung up the phone and, in her calm but cutting British accent, said, "You know, Americans already get a bad rap, but it doesn't help when you go out of your way to live up to the stereotype." Karen puffed herself up and shot back with, "Oh my God, your accent is awful. Where did you even learn to speak English?" Without missing a beat, my stepmom deadpanned, "England." The silence that followed was golden. You could practically hear the gears grinding in Karen's head as she tried to process that. She looked at me, at Charlie, at my stepmom, and then, finally, just gave up. She dragged her kids off with this storm cloud of embarrassment hanging over her, while we just stood there trying not to laugh too loud. My stepmom muttered something sharp in Welsh under her breath, and we went back to finding the hobby store like nothing had happened. Later, we shared the story with my dad, and it became one of those you had to be there kind of tales we'll probably laugh about for years. That's where the story ends. The funniest part to me is that the woman actually asked where she learned to speak English, and the answer was literally the birthplace of the language. It's wild how confidently wrong people can be. The deadpan delivery from her stepmom made it even better. Like, she didn't even need to argue, just one word shut it down completely. Honestly, moments like that stick with you because they're equal parts frustrating and hilarious. It's the kind of thing you replay in your head later and just shake your head at. This next story is about an entitled aunt who refused to respect boundaries and ended up with a painful surprise when she barged into the wrong room at the wrong time. Back when I was about 18 or 19, I was living at home with my dad, stepmom, and stepbrother. Everyone in the house understood one simple rule. If my bedroom door was closed, you knocked first. The lock on the door didn't work properly, so it really came down to respect and basic courtesy. My dad and the rest of the family always respected that, but my aunt, not a chance. She thought she was above things like knocking. She had this habit of barging in without warning, even if she knew I might be changing. I'd tell her not to. I'd remind her over and over, but it never mattered. So, one evening while my aunt and uncle were visiting, I was in my room changing clothes. I had just taken my top off when I heard the door creak open. I shouted, "I'm changing, wait outside." But just like always, she ignored me and kept pushing the door open. That was the last straw. I reached the door just as she was about to peek her head in, pulled it back slightly, and slammed it hard against her head. Not enough to seriously hurt her, but definitely enough to make it sting. The sound of her yelp was almost satisfying. She stumbled away from the door, clutching her head, and stomped downstairs to complain. I followed right after her, and she immediately started yelling at my dad about what I had done. My dad and uncle were already a couple of drinks in, sitting comfortably and watching sports, so neither of them really had the energy to deal with her drama. My dad just glanced at me, then at her, and muttered something like, "Yeah, don't do that." My uncle, on the other hand, burst out laughing. He thought it was hilarious that she got what she deserved. That only made her angrier. She demanded that they leave immediately, but my uncle wasn't having it. He told her he was in no condition to drive and that he and my dad were settled in for the cricket match. Frustrated, she tried calling my cousin, hoping he'd come to rescue her, but judging by the half of the conversation I could hear, he wasn't interested. He basically told her to stop picking stupid fights and refuse to drive over. So there she was, sitting on the couch, sulking with an ice pack that my stepmom had kindly handed her, while everyone else just carried on with their evening. Her outrage was completely ignored, and for once, the house was peaceful, except for her grumbling in the corner. Honestly, it turned out to be a pretty lovely night. That's the end of this story. I think what makes this one funny is how her reaction was way more dramatic than the actual bump on the head. She really expected everyone to rally behind her, but instead she got laughed at and brushed off. The uncle cracking up probably made it sting even more. What stood out most to me, though, was how she just had to sit there with her ice pack while everyone else enjoyed themselves. It's almost like the universe finally told her to knock it off. Literally. This next story is about an entitled mom at a coffee shop who thought it was perfectly fine to harass a pregnant woman, only to end up in handcuffs after pushing things way too far. It was the start of my shift, and I was actually in a good mood. Dinner had been decent, all my usual partners were on duty, and I was cruising in my patrol car listening to some old-school Backstreet Boys. Then dispatch came over the radio with a call about a disturbance at a local coffee shop. I figured it would be something minor, but as soon as I pulled up, I realized I was dealing with something else entirely. Standing right outside was a woman with that unmistakable haircut, mid-40s, red mark across her cheek, waving her arms like the world was ending. Before I could even step fully out of my patrol car, she rushed up to me, saying she had been attacked by a crazy woman inside. I asked her to wait outside, though, of course, she didn't listen. When I stepped into the shop, I spotted the so-called attacker. It was a young woman who was very clearly pregnant, at least 7 months along. She was sitting down, still fuming, and when I asked what happened, she laid it all out. She told me she had been minding her own business, ordering her coffee, when this other woman came up and started rubbing her belly without permission. She said she asked her to stop, but the touching continued. Then, when the barista placed her drink on the counter, the entitled mom snatched it away, insisting it was illegal to sell coffee to pregnant women. As if that wasn't enough, she apparently started criticizing her as a mother, saying she was endangering her baby. The pregnant mom tried to walk away, but the woman grabbed her again, refusing to let go of her stomach. That's when she slapped her across the face just to make her stop. While she was explaining, I could see the entitled mom through the window, rolling her eyes like it was all nonsense. By then, my partner had arrived, and she's the kind of officer who doesn't take nonsense from anyone. I asked her to keep an eye outside while I confirmed the story. The employees and the manager all backed up what the pregnant mom said. The manager even took me into the back office and showed me the security footage. Clear as day, it showed the entitled mom crowding the pregnant woman, grabbing at her belly, and blocking her when she tried to leave. That was all I needed. I walked back out, asked the pregnant mom if she wanted to press charges, and she immediately said yes. So I turned to the entitled mom and told her to place her hands behind her back. She exploded, screaming that it wasn't illegal to touch a pregnant woman, that the real criminals were the employees selling coffee, and that I had no right to arrest her. When I explained that you can't touch anyone without permission, pregnant or not, she tried to storm out of the shop. My partner stepped in front of her, and the look she gave was enough to freeze her in place. I took that moment to cuff her, but she started thrashing, screaming, even managed to knock off my body camera in the chaos. I had to carry her to the patrol car, and when we got there, she braced her feet against the doorframe to block me from putting her inside. My partner rolled her eyes, pulled out her taser, and gave her a quick zap to the leg. That did the trick. The whole ride to the jail, she was yelling about how she knew the sheriff, how I was going to lose my job, and how I didn't know who I was dealing with. By the time I handed her over to the jail staff, they were giving me that look like, what nightmare did you just dump on us? And the best part? I still had 9 hours left in my shift. That's where the story ends. The way she tried to spin the situation right in front of an officer is what really gets me. Like, she seriously thought touching a stranger's belly was fine, and that coffee was the real crime here. The pregnant woman handled herself better than most people would have, honestly. What stood out most to me, though, was the partner with the taser. Sometimes that no-nonsense approach is exactly what's needed. The image of her bracing her feet against the car door is just wild. You can almost picture the jail staff rolling their eyes, knowing they were about to deal with her meltdown next. This next story is about some entitled parents who thought they could take over someone's driveway for their beach day, only to find themselves dealing with a tow truck and the cops. Back when I was in my mid-20s, I lived on the bottom floor of a 2-story house in a busy beach town in North Carolina. The upstairs was rented by 4 college guys, so between all of us there were 5 cars trying to fit into a driveway that was really only built for 4. Most of the time, one of us had to park on the grass or use a paid spot nearby. But as locals, we could get passes for certain areas, which helped. In the summer though, finding parking was a headache. Our place was less than 100 yards from the beach, barely a 5-minute walk even if you were hauling gear or wrangling kids. Because of that, people were always circling for a place to leave their cars. I usually left the driveway for the guys upstairs and used my pass since I got home later than they did. But one morning I was running late and didn't leave until close to 8. The driveway was completely empty, so I figured I'd head out and let the others fill it later. As I was crossing the street, I saw a minivan pull straight into our driveway. Out stepped a dad in a polo and visor, a mom who was overly peppy, and 3 kids who were already screaming about getting to the beach. I didn't recognize them, so I walked back up and asked if they knew the tenants upstairs or had permission to park there. The mom brushed me off, saying it didn't matter because nobody was parked, and her kids needed to get to the beach now. The dad stepped in, accusing me of lying about living there, and claiming I just didn't like that they figured out how to park for free. I pointed to my own car parked legally with a pass, but they weren't having it. The dad got right in my face, practically nose to nose, and told me to try it and see if I wanted to tow them. At that point, I just said, "Okay, have a nice day," and walked off. As soon as they were down at the beach, I called a tow company on the other side of town. They said it'd take over an hour, but that was fine with me. I wasn't paying a dime. It would be their problem. By the time the tow truck rolled in and hooked their van, it was long gone. I slid my own car into the driveway and waited. Hours later, there was furious pounding at my door. When I opened it, beer in hand and grinning, they demanded to know where their van was. I calmly handed them the tow company's card and shut the door. The dad kept banging, even tried to shove his way inside, yelling that he'd get me arrested. I pushed him out and locked up, figuring the cops would be along soon enough. Sure enough, a local officer I actually knew showed up not long after. He told me the couple claimed I'd stolen their van and broken into the house. I explained what really happened, how they had no permission, mouthed off, and I had them towed. The officer already knew me and the tow company, so it wasn't hard to clear up. Meanwhile, the dad started yelling at the officer, shoving past him, and trying to come inside again. That earned him a trip pressed up against the squad car. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges, but I just said to keep him in the car until they got a cab. While they waited, I grabbed another beer, slipped up to the upstairs porch, and sat there watching with a smile as they stewed until their ride showed up. That's the end of this story. Man, the confidence some people have blows my mind. Like, parking in a stranger's driveway and then acting like you're the victim takes a special kind of entitlement. The funniest part to me is how the dad kept trying to escalate it in front of an officer, like that was going to work in his favor. What stood out most, though, was how calmly it all played out on your end, just sitting back with a beer while their whole day unraveled. Honestly, that tow truck must have been the most satisfying sight rolling up. This next story is about an entitled aunt who tried to take her niece's laptop and, when she couldn't, decided to destroy it instead. So this happened when I was 17. My aunt, who I hadn't seen in about 10 years, came to visit from Texas with her 3 kids. I wasn't thrilled about it, mostly because her oldest son used to pick on me constantly when we were younger. But I put on my best fake smile, greeted them, and even let the 2 younger kids go upstairs to play on my Xbox, while the adults sat around catching up. Now, for context, I do a lot of video editing and Photoshop work. A few months before this visit, I'd bought myself a 15-inch MacBook Pro. It wasn't cheap. It cost around $5,000, but I'd worked hard to save up for it. My old desktop just wasn't cutting it anymore, and this laptop was what I needed for school projects and creative work. So while everyone's chatting downstairs, my aunt decides to wander upstairs. I follow her, figuring I'll show her around the house. The second she spots my MacBook, she immediately asks whose laptop it is. I told her it was mine, and she asked if she could hold it. I hesitated, but said sure. She picked it up, looked it over, and then, out of nowhere, asked if she could keep it. I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but she was dead serious. I told her no, of course not. She tried offering me $500 for it, saying it couldn't be worth more than that. I explained that it was closer to $5,000 and that I'd saved up and worked hard to buy it. She didn't like that answer one bit. She went on about how she hadn't seen us in 10 years, how I never gave her a gift, and how she deserved it. When I stood my ground, she snapped. She opened the MacBook, threw it onto the hard floor, and then stomped on it with her high heels. I just stood there in shock, realizing it was completely ruined. If the house had carpet, maybe it would have survived, but the tile floor made sure it didn't stand a chance. I yelled for my parents, and they came running. My mom demanded to know what happened, and my aunt actually admitted, mumbling that she destroyed it because I wouldn't give it to her. That was the final straw. She and her kids were immediately banned from our house. Since I was just about to turn 18, I decided I'd wait until then so I could take legal action myself. Sure enough, once I was officially an adult, I filed a police report and took her to court. With photos, witnesses, and my parents' statements, the case was clear. The judge ruled in my favor, and my aunt now owes me a lot of money for the damage she caused. That's where this story ends. Honestly, the wildest part to me is how casual she was about destroying something she knew wasn't hers. Like, she didn't even try to deny it. She straight up told your mom why she did it. That takes entitlement to a whole new level. What stood out to me, though, was how well documented it all ended up being. Between pictures, witnesses, and even your parents catching her in the act, it was like she practically set herself up to lose in court. The fact that you got justice in the end makes the whole thing way more satisfying. This next story is about a mom who tried to dump her kid into a program without enrolling him and then ran off, expecting free childcare. Back when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I ran a free after-school program out of a community center. The program was designed for kids between 8 and 12 whose parents were going through messy divorces. We helped them process things like anger, the idea of joint custody, changes in finances, and what terms like alimony or child support actually meant. It wasn't just a babysitting setup. We actually had a sister program next door for the parents. So while the kids were with me and another volunteer, the adults were in a structured class of their own. It was important, meaningful work. The program was free, but since budgets were tight, I usually ended up paying out of pocket for snacks, coloring materials, and little prizes. I didn't mind. It added to my resume, and I genuinely enjoyed helping the kids. By the time this happened, we were already a few weeks into a term, and I had 8 kids attending regularly. 8 was the perfect number, because most things came in packs of 8. If I bought Nutella snack packs, Capri Suns, or workbooks, every kid got one, and nothing went to waste. That day, everything was set up just like usual, until a woman I'd never seen before walked in, pushing along a kid I didn't know. She didn't introduce herself or her child, just sort of dropped him off and turned to leave. I quickly stopped her and explained that he wasn't enrolled and she couldn't just leave him there. She brushed me off and said she'd heard the class was free. I told her it was, but reminded her it wasn't a daycare. You couldn't just shove kids into the program without registering. I explained that I needed basic information like his name, allergies, and an emergency contact before I could even consider it. She huffed and rolled her eyes, saying she had an appointment and I should just take him for now. I told her I couldn't, not only because of safety, but because I didn't even have enough supplies or snacks for an extra student. I pointed her toward how she could enroll him for the next term instead. She left in a huff, dragging her kid with her, and I figured that was the end of it. But about 10 minutes into the session, the door creaked open. That same kid was suddenly shoved inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. My co-volunteer and I just stared at each other for a second. When I opened the door, I saw the mom sprinting down the hallway, yelling over her shoulder that she'd be back in a few hours. I had to half run after her, telling her if she didn't come back for her son immediately, I'd have no choice but to call the police for an unaccompanied minor. That got her to stop. She turned and gave me the angriest glare, accusing me of being inflexible and having terrible customer service. I reminded her she wasn't a customer and needed to take her son back. She finally grabbed his hand and stormed off, screaming that she'd tell my boss how horrible I was. What she didn't know was, I was the boss. That story wraps up here. What cracks me up about this one is how she tried to treat the program like a daycare she could just dump her kid into whenever it suited her. The part where she shoved him in the room and bolted really says it all. Like, she thought she could outrun responsibility. And calling it bad customer service was just the cherry on top, especially since you were the one running the whole thing. It's one of those stories where the entitlement is so over the top that it almost feels like a comedy sketch. This next story is about a rude customer at McDonald's who mocked an employee for being deaf and demanded special treatment over the simplest things. Back when I was a teenager, I worked at McDonald's. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and I actually liked being upfront with customers because I could see their faces and read lips. That mattered because I lost my hearing at age 12 after developing bacterial meningitis. I'd learned to speak before then, so I could still talk clearly, but reading lips was my main way of communicating. Most people were understanding when I explained this. Most people, but not all. One day, I was working the front counter like usual when a woman and her young son walked in. I gave my standard greeting, even signing as I spoke, but she never looked up from her phone. I couldn't see her lips at all, so I explained politely, "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm deaf. I read lips. Could you look up for me?" Instead of cooperating, she rolled her eyes and muttered something that I caught perfectly. She called me a retard. My stomach dropped at that, but I forced a smile and tried to keep things professional. When I asked for her order, she exaggerated her words, speaking so slowly and awkwardly that it was actually harder to understand her. She demanded a Diet Coke and a Happy Meal toy, and here's the thing. Drinks are always $1, but the toys cost extra unless you're buying the full Happy Meal. When I rang it up, she accused me of discriminating against her son and said I was forcing her to pay for the toy. I didn't want to start a scene, so I just gave her the toy for free and moved on. I figured that would end it, but it didn't. I handed her the cup for the soda after she paid, and she immediately waved her hand in my face. "You never got me my drink," she snapped. I pointed to the drink station behind her and explained that customers fill their own cups when they come inside. She wasn't having it. She leaned over the counter and said, word for word, "That's your job. Do I look like I work for McDonald's?" My jaw nearly hit the floor. I ended up filling her drink at the drive-thru machine just to shut her down. But while I was doing that, a coworker tapped me on the shoulder. When I turned, I saw her son mocking me, pretending to sign and laughing. And the worst part, she joined him. She actually encouraged her kid to make fun of me for being deaf. That was the breaking point. I held it together long enough to finish the shift, but when I went to the back, I broke down and cried. That night, I realized I couldn't stay in fast food anymore. About a week later, I turned in my 2 weeks' notice. That's where the story ends. This one really stuck with me. It's one thing to deal with rude customers, but watching a parent actually encourage their kid to make fun of someone, that hits on another level. What stood out to me most was how strong you were in that moment, even though it broke you down later. Honestly, the fact that you handled it with so much patience when she was throwing that kind of energy at you is impressive. And the kid copying his mom, that just shows how entitlement rubs off. Some stories leave me shaking my head, and this is definitely one of them. This next story is about a restaurant worker who got accused of serving alcohol to a child, only to find out the mother had set the whole thing up herself. When I was 19, I worked as a server at a family-friendly restaurant that also had a bar attached. The bar side was strictly 21 and over, but the main dining area was open to kids and families. Because of that, it was always part of our training to be extra careful with drinks, especially when alcohol was involved. Anyone ordering a cocktail or beer had to show ID before we even placed the order. One morning during the breakfast rush, I was serving a table with 2 people, a little girl who looked around 8 or 9, and her mom. The girl asked for an orange juice, and her mom ordered water and a mimosa. I checked the mom's ID. It showed she was born in the early 80s, so everything looked fine. I went to grab the drinks. I poured the orange juice myself, got a glass of water, and let the bartender know about the mimosa. A couple minutes later, I carried all 3 drinks over to their table. Everything seemed normal at first. I took their meal orders and headed back to the kitchen. But when I returned with their plates, the mother suddenly yelled at me, saying I had served alcohol to her child. I froze for a second because I knew that wasn't possible. I had poured the juice myself and hadn't even gone near the bar while carrying it. I tried to stay calm and explained that no alcohol went anywhere near her kid's drink, but she shoved the glass toward me and told me to smell it. And when I did, I was shocked. It did smell like alcohol. Still, I knew I hadn't spiked it. I told her the only explanation was that either she wasn't paying attention or someone else had added something after I left the table. The mom doubled down, glaring at me, and demanding to see my manager. She even started yelling about suing me for giving alcohol to a child. My manager came over, heard both sides, and called security just to be safe, since the kid had apparently taken a couple sips. We all went back to review the security footage. What we saw left no room for argument. The cameras clearly showed me dropping off the drinks, then leaving. Right after I walked away, the mom picked up her daughter's orange juice took a big drink from it, then topped it back up with her own mimosa. And then she actually told her daughter to drink it. That explained everything. The fallout was immediate. Security called the police, and the mom was arrested for giving alcohol to her child. On top of that, she was permanently banned from the restaurant. If she ever sets foot inside again, it'll mean another arrest. Later, I even found out from another staff member that the girl hadn't wanted orange juice at all. She had asked for chocolate milk, but her mom told her to order juice just so she could pull this stunt. When I heard that, I made sure the girl finally got her chocolate milk. That's where the story ends. This one really shows how far some people will go to create chaos. What stuck with me was how calm the server stayed, even when it looked like they were about to get blamed for something serious. The wildest part is that the mom set up her own kid just to make it happen. Honestly, I'm glad the cameras caught everything, because without that footage, it could have gone very differently. And the fact that the little girl just wanted chocolate milk the whole time makes the mom's actions seem even more ridiculous. This next story is about a relative who demanded money for her son's college tuition, even though she once refused to help with housing for the storyteller's own education. I got my first proper job about 3 months ago. It wasn't fast food like the little part-time gigs I had before. This was a real job with steady hours and a paycheck I could actually plan around. Since I live away from my parents while going to an international school, most of my money goes straight to rent, groceries, and savings for university. But as a cultural tradition, when I received my very first paycheck, I gifted it to my parents. It wasn't much, but it was a way of showing gratitude, and they were really touched. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. That lasted maybe 10 minutes. My mom shared the news with our family group chat, proud of me, and right after that, my phone rang. It was my aunt. Now, this was someone who had barely acknowledged my existence until that very moment, so I was suspicious. She asked about the details of my job, how much I was making, and at first it sounded like casual curiosity. But then she dropped the real reason for her call. She told me that since her son, my cousin, who's in the same grade as me, was getting ready to go to college, I should put part of my next paycheck toward his school fees. According to her, since I now had a source of income and was part of the family, it was my duty to support him. For context, my aunt earns way more than I do. She has a stable, well-paying job, but apparently, she doesn't want to spend her own money on expenses that don't directly benefit her. The irony is that when I first got into this school, my mom asked if I could stay with my aunt until I graduated. She refused, saying she didn't have space. So my parents ended up getting me a small flat, which I helped pay for by working. Now suddenly, she wanted my help because her son's education was a family responsibility. She went on about how hard he had worked to get into college, even though I know he barely studies, stays out late, and puts in minimal effort. I explained as politely as I could that my paycheck barely covered my own needs, rent, food, and saving for my own tuition. Her response? She snapped back that if I could manage those things, then clearly I could afford to donate some money for my cousin. At that point, my patience ran out. I hung up on her before I said something harsher. Not long after, my mom called me asking why her sister was complaining. I explained the whole story, and thankfully, my mom immediately took my side. She even blocked her sister, which says a lot. My aunt didn't stop there, though. She's been bothering other relatives, trying to guilt trip them into paying, and probably ranting nonstop in the family chat about how selfish everyone is for not helping. Honestly, it feels exhausting, but also a little freeing to finally vent about it. That's where this story ends. What stands out the most is how quickly the aunt shifted from barely acknowledging a relative to suddenly demanding money. That level of entitlement really jumps off the page. It's especially ironic that she once refused to help with something as basic as housing, yet expected financial support for her own child's college. The contrast between her behavior and the parents' immediate support says a lot about where real family loyalty lies. It's one of those situations that shows how money can bring out the true colors in people. This next story is about a woman whose toxic mother not only blamed her for her husband's affair, but even went so far as to try arranging marriages for her underage daughters. I never thought I'd be making a post about my own mother, but here I am. I'm 45 and my mom is 71. We've always had a difficult relationship. She was the classic old school wife, never worked a day outside the home, had 13 kids, and clung to outdated values like her life depended on it. She came to the US from Guatemala at 14, married my dad young, and raised us all under that same strict, suffocating mindset. The reality is, most of my siblings don't want anything to do with her anymore. 2 of them passed away, and almost everyone else keeps their distance. I was the only one who stayed close. I looked after my parents as they got older, and when my dad died, I even started covering my mom's bills so she wouldn't struggle financially. You'd think she'd be grateful, but instead she made my life harder. When it came to my marriage, she was a constant source of stress. She always babied my husband, always sided with him, and constantly criticized me. I only wanted one child, but my husband pushed for more. He had promised before marriage that one was fine, but he changed his mind after. And with my mother in his corner, I never stood a chance. At one point, the 2 of them actually tampered with my birth control, so I'd end up pregnant again. I don't regret my youngest daughter for a second, but the betrayal left a scar. After that, I secretly had my tubes tied. My mom never forgave me for that, and for years she berated me for only having 2 kids and called me faulty. To her, a woman's value was tied to how many children she could produce. Then came the breaking point, my husband. He was 49 when he died in a car crash. But before that, he had been living a double life. I found out he'd been having an affair with a woman barely older than our daughters. She was 24 when she died in the same crash, and the 2 of them had just had twin boys together. My daughters were the first to find out. He had taken them to the hospital to meet the babies and told them to keep it secret from me. When they refused, he turned cruel. He became abusive toward them and toward me. By the time of the crash, we were already in the middle of a divorce. You'd think my mother would comfort me after all of this. But no, she blamed me. According to her, it was my fault for working, for not giving him enough children, for not being pretty enough anymore. She said he had no choice but to go find someone younger. She even scolded me for refusing to adopt the twins, as if I should have happily taken on the children from his affair. It was heartbreaking to hear, but not surprising. And then things got worse. My oldest daughter, who's 16, recently came out. I was proud of her for telling me, especially in the middle of all this chaos. But when she told my mother, the reaction was horrific. My mom hung up the phone on her, then called me screaming. She said my daughter was sick, confused, and needed to be fixed. She started sending me links to conversion camps, articles from so-called doctors who claimed they could cure her, even suggested an exorcism. I told her to stop or she'd lose all contact with us. She was quiet for one day. Then the floodgates opened. I suddenly started getting messages from grown men in their 20s and older, asking if it was true that I was looking to marry off my 16-year-old. My stomach dropped. That's when I realized my mother had gone behind my back, contacting people and actively trying to find husbands for my daughters. Not only that, but she had given out their phone numbers. My daughters were terrified. We acted fast. We changed all our numbers, locked down their social media accounts, and went straight to the police. We filed for a restraining order, starting with a temporary one and pushing for it to become permanent. The officer we spoke with was incredible. He took everything seriously, even arranged for regular check-ins on our house. He also worked with my lawyer to make sure the restraining order covered not just my mother, but anyone trying to act on her behalf. My brother moved in with us for extra support. He's been especially helpful for my oldest daughter, since he came out decades ago and understands what she's going through in a way I can't. My youngest, who's 14, has started to relax a little too. She's even gotten excited about looking for a new home, one with what she calls the perfect yard. We've all agreed this house is no longer right for us. It's my childhood home, but now it feels heavy with memories of my husband's betrayal, my mother's interference, and years of stress. Selling or renting it out is the best choice, even though it hurts. As for my mother, I've cut her off completely. I stopped paying her bills, blocked her number, and told her siblings, my aunts, that I was done. They're on my side. They've said flat out that what she's done isn't cultural, it's not tradition, it's just her being unhinged. There's even an investigation being reopened into her past behavior. With any luck, the restraining order will be expedited because minors are involved. At this point, I've decided I don't have a mother anymore. I had parents when my dad was alive, but when he died, so did that part of my life. Now it's just me and my daughters starting over. And honestly, I feel lighter knowing I finally drew the line. That's where the story ends. That one was intense. It's one thing to have a difficult parent, but This went way beyond that, crossing boundaries no parent should ever even think of crossing. What really stood out to me was how fast she acted to protect her daughters, even when it meant cutting off her own mother. That couldn't have been easy, but it was the right call. I also liked how her brother stepped in. Having someone in the house who gets it must have been such a relief for the girls. And honestly, the fact that her youngest is already looking forward to a new home shows they're moving in the right direction. It's a heavy story, but at least now it feels like they're building something better. This next story is about a man who was disowned by his family 15 years ago, only for them to suddenly show up in his life again and start stalking him after all that time apart. When I was 19, I went through a rough patch that changed everything. My ID had been stolen and used in another state, which caused my driver's license to get suspended nationwide. On top of that, I already had a couple of tickets I couldn't pay because I was barely keeping up with rent. My full-time job was on the edge of collapse, so I was scrambling with freelance work to stay afloat. I thought if I just held on long enough, I'd catch up and fix things. But that didn't happen. Eventually, I got arrested and spent 2 weeks in jail. It wasn't a violent crime, and in some ways, it cleared out my tickets and forced me to deal with the mess. But to my family, it was unforgivable. They decided I brought shame to the family name, so they disowned me. Just like that, I lost my family, my support system, everything. I only survived because I had just enough to cover rent and kept picking up freelance jobs. 6 months later, I finally cleared the license issue with the other state, but by then, the damage was done. After that, I cut ties completely. I changed my last name, got a new phone number, locked down my social media tighter than Fort Knox, and just started over. I finished college, built my career, and for the first time in my life, I was happy. My circle was small, just a few close friends, but I was content. Then, out of nowhere, 15 years later, there was a knock at my door. It was my parents. I hadn't seen or spoken to them in all that time. I asked how they found me, and my mom admitted they paid $5,000 to a private investigator. They told me it had been long enough, that I'd learned my lesson, and that I'd missed out on so much family life. But all I could say was, yes, I've learned my lesson. One of them being that I can't count on anyone, not even my own family. And yes, I succeeded, but I did it without you. Please leave and don't come back. Then I shut the door. I hoped that was the end of it, but they didn't go away. They started showing up, following me around, basically stalking me. Honestly, they weren't dangerous, just relentless. A friend of mine started calling them fleas, because they just wouldn't leave me alone. We even made a bit of a game out of it. If I had fleas, my friend would come hang out and we'd mess with them. Like going to a fancy restaurant I knew they'd never step into, or walking into an adult store just to watch them squirm. It was funny for a while, but it didn't change the fact that they wouldn't leave me alone. Eventually, I had to face them head on. We met in a park near my apartment, and I told them flat out that this was the only time I would ever talk to them. I even told them I was their judge and jury, and all they could do was explain themselves before I made my final decision. I asked why they disowned me and why they wanted back in now. Their answer was the same old thing, that I had shamed the family, and cutting me off was the only way to make it right. Now that the family had grown with in-laws, nieces, and nephews, they didn't want to keep hiding me anymore. Hearing that, I felt my heart pounding in my ears. I told them I'd done everything alone, and that I didn't need them then, and I don't need them now. I reminded them that the only person who ever stood by me was a cousin by marriage, which is why I even took her last name when I started over. I told them they made their choice 15 years ago, and this was mine now. I warned them that if they kept showing up or following me, I'd go to a lawyer and get the law involved. Then I walked away. Back in my apartment, I locked everything down, pulled the curtains, and finally let it all out. After holding it together through the confrontation, I just broke down and cried. That's where this story ends. Man, that's heavy. 15 years is such a long time to be completely on your own, and then to suddenly have those same people come back like nothing ever happened. It had to feel surreal. What stood out to me is how strong he was in the confrontation, even when he admitted afterward that it left him shaken. That's a lot of weight to carry. I also kind of respect how he and his friend turned it into a joke for a while, messing with them instead of letting it eat away at him. But at the end of the day, setting that hard boundary was the only way forward. It's a rough situation, but you can tell he's not going back. This next story is about a guy whose lunch was stolen by another customer's family, only for that theft to backfire in the most chaotic way possible. So I went out to lunch one afternoon at this local spot that's famous for its fried chicken sandwiches. The place was packed, so I had to grab a seat outside. It was 95 degrees out, but the patio had shade and big fans running. So it was hot, but still manageable. I already knew exactly what I wanted to order. So when my waiter came by, I got my order in right away. Behind me sat this loud couple with their teenage son. They were bickering nonstop about what to order, and at the same time complaining about how slow the service was. It seemed like they were in another server's section, because while I'd already placed my order, they were still sitting there complaining, trying to flag someone down. Eventually, a different waiter came to their table, took their order, but even then they couldn't stop whining. I felt bad for the poor waiter stuck with them. Not even 10 minutes later, my sandwich showed up. It was hot, fresh, and exactly what I'd been craving. That's when I hear the dad behind me practically shouting, "Oh, hell no! That dude got here after us and he gets his food first." He wasn't even talking to the waiter. He was directing it at me. He started yelling, Hey, why come you got your sandwich first? You hear me?" I tried ignoring him, hoping he'd calm down, but instead the guy actually stood up, walked right over, and before I could react, he grabbed my plate off the table. Just straight up stole my lunch. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You can wait. My kid's hungry." Then he handed the sandwich to his son and told him to eat it. Here's the thing though, I like my chicken spicy. And not just a little kick spicy. I had ordered the second hottest level on their menu, covered in a sauce made with Scotch bonnets and ghost peppers. We're talking close to 1,000,000 on the Scoville scale. It's the kind of heat that makes most people sweat, cry, and question their life choices. The son, who hadn't said a word this whole time, took one giant bite, like he was Cookie Monster devouring a cookie. Within seconds, the gagging started. He went from chewing to choking, then straight into vomiting, right onto his dad. The mom started screaming. People at the nearby tables jumped up. Plates clattered to the ground. It was chaos. The dad spun around at me, yelling, "What did you do to my son?" Meanwhile, I was standing there laughing because the whole scene had turned into a full-blown circus. One guy at another table was doubled over crying with laughter, while another woman looked like she was about to throw up just from watching. Two waiters rushed over, trying to get control of the situation. The dad was red-faced and furious. The mom was panicked, and the kid was still wheezing and choking from the heat of the sauce. Another customer even stepped in between me and the dad to keep him from blowing up any further. When the manager arrived, the whole story came out, and to top it off, their actual order had just shown up right then. The manager told the family they weren't welcome back, and packed up their food to go. Meanwhile, I was brought inside, given a replacement sandwich, handed a $50 gift card, and politely asked not to leave a bad review or press charges. So yeah, that's how my quiet lunch turned into absolute chaos, all because some guy couldn't wait for his own food. That's the end of this story. That one had me picturing it like a full comedy sketch. The dad thought he was pulling some kind of power move, but instead he just set his kid up for disaster. What really stands out is how fast the whole scene escalated. From him yelling, to the kid gagging, to the mom panicking, to strangers either laughing or looking sick. And honestly, the part that made me laugh the most is that the restaurant not only banned the family, but also rewarded the guy who lost his sandwich. It's like instant karma in action, all playing out in real time. This next story is about a bride who came up with a clever way to handle her controlling mother, who tried to upstage her by wearing a wedding gown to her own daughter's wedding. Earlier this year, my wife and I received an invitation to the wedding of an old shipmate of mine from my Coast Guard days. I'll call him Chief and his fiancée Chiefette. We were excited to go. I called Chief to formally accept, mailed the RSVP, and we set aside the travel funds. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Then, a couple of weeks later, Chief called again with a strange request. He explained that Chiefette's mother had decided she was going to wear her own wedding gown to the ceremony. Instead of getting into a battle with her, the bride had come up with a different idea. She wanted every female guest to wear white, or even a wedding gown if they had one. Chief asked if my wife would wear hers. My wife was thrilled. She could still fit into her dress, and she laughed that she'd probably never get another chance to wear it again. So, when the big day came, I put on my suit and she walked beside me in her gown. When we arrived, the room was already filled with women in white. some in full gowns, others in simple white dresses. The atmosphere felt almost like a secret alliance, everyone waiting to see what would happen when the bride's mother showed up. I joined Chief outside just as his future mother-in-law arrived. She stepped out of the car in an explosion of tulle, like she was auditioning for a fairy tale. Her dress was massive, dramatic, and completely over the top. She strutted up with her chin high, clearly braced for someone to challenge her. But Chief just smiled, welcomed her, and held the door open. When she walked inside and saw about 20 women, all dressed in white, her face froze. She went from smug to outraged in seconds. She started screaming at everyone, calling them shameful for wearing white to her daughter's wedding, and demanding that they leave immediately. Her husband, looking mortified, quietly reminded her that she herself was in a wedding gown at her daughter's wedding. She shouted back, "That's different. I'm her mother." But when it came out that her daughter had personally asked all the women to wear white, her fury deflated. She looked stunned, like she couldn't believe she'd been outmaneuvered. A few minutes later, the music started, and we all filed into the chapel. Then the real twist. Chiefette walked in wearing a breathtaking gown of red and gold. The moment she appeared, all eyes were on her, exactly as it should have been. Her mother left almost immediately after the ceremony, clearly defeated. Later at the reception, I found out the whole plan had been inspired by a post the bride had read on Reddit. She had turned the drama into her own moment of victory, and honestly, it was brilliant. That's where this story ends. That was such a clever move. Instead of fighting her mom head-on, the bride found a way to flip the whole situation so the spotlight was exactly where it belonged. What I love about it is that it wasn't aggressive. It was playful, but it still made the point crystal clear. The image of all those women standing there in white, only for the bride to sweep in wearing red and gold, must have been incredible. It's one of those moments you can just picture everyone in the room remembering forever. This next story is about a toxic parent who tried to twist her child's words during a family crisis and ended up destroying her own future in the process. The closest person in my entire life has always been my grandmother. She was the one who saved me when I was growing up, because my mother was abusive. Whenever my mom threw me out of the house, which happened several times when I was between 13 and 16, I knew I could always take a taxi in the middle of the night to my grandma's place. She'd come downstairs in her robe, pay the fare, and take me inside like it was the most natural thing in the world. When I had thoughts of hurting myself, she was the one I'd call, or the one I'd run to. She's my mother's mother, but even she knows her daughter is cruel and destructive. She's never once denied what kind of person my mom is, and she's seen firsthand the pain I've been through. A few years back, my grandma suddenly collapsed. She couldn't breathe. Her heart barely responded, and she was rushed to the hospital unconscious. The doctors didn't give us much hope. After 3 months of her lying there, they told us we should start considering hospice care. They asked if we wanted her intubated again, if she stopped breathing, or if we should let her go. By then, I hadn't spoken to my mom in years. But in that situation, I ended up talking to her again. One day, she called me in tears, asking me what to do. Should we keep grandma on the machines? Should we let her go? I loved my grandmother more than anything, but I also knew what she wanted. She had always said she never wanted to be kept alive, like a vegetable. She was proud, independent, and strong. So I told my mom. She's still alive now, so we hold on to that. But if she goes to hospice, I don't think we should prolong her life by force. And in that moment, everything flipped. My mom's voice changed completely. She laughed and yelled, "Ha! Got you. I knew you wanted her gone. I recorded this, you idiot. Now everyone will know, and the inheritance will be mine." She mocked me, telling me she'd use that recording to prove I wanted to end my grandma's life. 2 days later, against all odds, my grandma woke up. Slowly, she regained her strength. It took 6 months of recovery, but she fully came back, and she's been doing well for 6 years since then. But my mom didn't stop. She started visiting my grandma, playing that recording over and over, claiming I wanted to off her. My grandmother's response? She'd just tell her to shut up, saying, "I wouldn't want to spend the rest of my life on a ventilator either." She was right. My grandma knew exactly what I meant, and she never once believed my mom's lies. Eventually, my grandmother made a new will, one that couldn't be challenged, one signed off by lawyers and psychologists. She disinherited my mother completely. If my mom had just acted like a decent human being, she would have inherited something by default. but now she'll get nothing. That's where the story ends. That was brutal, but honestly kind of satisfying. The way the mom tried to twist that phone call into some kind of trap just shows how far she was willing to go. What stood out to me was how solid the grandmother was. She didn't fall for it, not even for a second. Instead, she doubled down on protecting the one person who had been there for her. It's wild to think how different this could have gone, but in the end, the mom ended up outsmarting herself. This next story is about a plane ride where a passenger was pressured to give up his seat because another parent claimed his appearance scared their child. I'm 24, and just a few months ago, I had to undergo a really tough surgery called an orbital exenteration. Basically, I lost my right eye and part of the tissue around it because of an aggressive cancer. It left me with a noticeable gap on one side of my face. I haven't been wearing prosthetics or coverings yet because I'm still trying to accept the way I look. And honestly, I'm still processing all of it. Most days I can handle the stares or quick glances from strangers. But when kids get scared, that hits me harder. It's not their fault, but it always stings. On this particular day, I was flying to Boston. I booked my usual spot by the window because it makes me feel calmer on long flights. After I settled in, a woman walked on with her husband and their young son, probably around 4 or 5 years old. Her husband sat behind me, while she and her son sat in my row. The second the boy looked at me, he physically pulled back, like I had startled him. That reaction hurt, but I expected his mom to just reassure him and tell him to be polite. Instead, she leaned over and asked me to switch seats with her husband. She explained that her son wasn't comfortable sitting near me and that it would really help them out. I told her no, I wanted my window seat. She kept asking a few more times, but when I didn't budge, she finally gave up with a comment that cut deep. She said something like, "Seriously? He's only a child. I just thought you might be a little more sensitive." That crushed me. Sensitive? I've been sensitive every single day since my surgery. Sensitive enough that I've avoided mirrors, avoided going out, and avoided cameras because I can't stand seeing what's missing. Sensitive enough that I still fight tears when I feel like I don't belong in public. And now here she was, acting like I was the one being inconsiderate just for existing. For the rest of the flight, I had to sit there holding myself together while replaying her words in my head. It wasn't the stares from her son that got to me. It was how she treated me, like I was the problem, like I owed it to them to disappear or move. And that feeling stayed with me long after the flight landed. That's where the story ends. Man, that really hit hard. What stood out to me was how the mom handled it. She had the perfect chance to teach her kid about empathy, and instead just doubled down on making someone else feel small. Honestly, it takes a lot of courage to even travel and go about life after a surgery like that, and to then be told you should move because of someone else's discomfort is just brutal. The way I see it, choosing to stay in that window seat wasn't being insensitive. It was standing your ground when you had every right to. This next story is about a trip to the park that turned into chaos when a family tried to take someone's dog and things nearly turned into a fight. I've got 2 dogs, an older Chihuahua who's calm and steady, and a younger Cheagle who's playful to the point of being chaotic. One afternoon, I figured they could both use some exercise, so I packed up a gallon of water, collapsible bowls, a couple treats, and their favorite toys. The day was warm, but not unbearable, with just enough breeze to make the park inviting. I loaded them into the car, and off we went. When we arrived, the park wasn't crowded. A couple families were nearby, and some people were playing volleyball a little ways off. I found a big open spot where there was plenty of space for the dogs to run, then let them loose. My Chihuahua, who I'll call Jay, stayed close to me, lounging near her water bowl and her stuffed toy. Meanwhile, my Chiggle, let's call her C, was in full zoomy mode, sprinting across the grass, tail wagging so hard her whole back end shook. She has that type of personality where she sees fun happening anywhere and immediately wants to join in. For about 5 minutes, things were perfect. I threw their ball around, tried not to get bowled over by C crashing into my legs, and just enjoyed the sunshine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed C's attention lock onto a group of kids playing near a van. Before I could stop her, she darted across the grass like a rocket, heading straight for them. I whistled, clapped, called her name, everything I normally do to get her back, but she was too excited and kept going. At first, I wasn't worried. C is friendly, and I figured one of the kids would hold her until I got there. She bounced around their feet, tail wagging like crazy. One of the kids bent down and started petting her, and for a second I thought, good, they'll keep her put. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The kid's mom bent down, scooped C up, and put her straight into her child's arms. She immediately shut the van door behind them, saying, "Go, go," as if she was in a rush to get out of there. That's when I started shouting, "Hey, that's my dog, stop," and made my way over as fast as I could with my cane. My heart was pounding, partly from the effort and partly from panic. Before I could reach them, though, a man, who I assumed was the father, stepped out of the van and blocked me. He put his hand on my chest to stop me, and because I was walking quickly, I nearly lost my balance. I steadied myself and yelled again that they had taken my dog. Then another man, maybe an uncle, came around and got in my face. He wagged his finger at me like I was a child and said, No, he's ours. We found him. We adopted him. Legally." That word, legally, nearly made me laugh out of disbelief. They had literally just scooped my dog off the grass, and now they were pretending it was theirs. The father cut him off and jabbed a finger into my chest, saying I better back away. At that point, I raised my cane and told them not to push me any further and to give me back my dog. Meanwhile, the mom was across the van holding onto her kid, shouting that I already had one dog and that her kid deserved this one. The whole thing felt unreal. Like, they truly thought they were entitled to just claim someone else's pet because they wanted to. While this was happening, Jay, my chihuahua, trotted over and stood behind me, almost like she knew something was wrong. I told her to get to the car, and she immediately turned and ran that way. That gave me some relief, but C was still in their arms. My hands were shaking, partly from anger, partly from fear, because I honestly thought this could turn physical. Thankfully, that's when two women who had been nearby walked over. One of them spoke up loudly, saying, "No, that's not right. We were here when he arrived, and those are his dogs." That was enough to make the father pause. He turned to the kid, took C out of their arms, and set her down on the ground. She sprinted back toward me, tail wagging, totally oblivious to the fact that she'd almost been stolen. The kid holding her just said, "Bye doggy, you're cute," like it was no big deal. Meanwhile, the uncle threw out one last threat, saying I better not show up again or I'd regret it. They piled back into their van, glaring at me the whole time, and drove off. The two women who had stepped in asked if I was okay, and I thanked them over and over. Without them, I don't know how that would have ended. I gathered up the toys C had dropped in her excitement, walked back to the car, and loaded up both dogs. By the time we got home, I was still shaking, part fear, part anger, but also just relieved. My dogs were safe, and that was all that mattered. That's where this story ends. This one is just wild. The entitlement of trying to claim someone else's dog right in front of them is on another level. What's crazy is how calm the bystanders had to be to step in and call it out, and that ended up being the turning point. I think what stood out most is how quickly things could have gone way worse, but instead it ended with the dogs safe and a couple of strangers proving how important it is to speak up when something looks off. And honestly, picturing the dog running back all excited, like nothing even happened, almost makes it feel surreal after all that tension. This next story is about a mother who ignored every boundary and threw a gender reveal her daughter never wanted, without even including her. This happened almost 2 years ago, back when I was pregnant. For some background, my mom has always been narcissistic and controlling. She pretended to soften up once my siblings and I became adults. But the second I got pregnant, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, everything had to be her way. And if I resisted, she would scream that I was making it all about me, when in reality, she was the one making it all about her. One of the first things she demanded was a gender reveal. I had no idea why she cared so much, since she never had one when she was pregnant with me or my brothers. Even they started pressuring me about it, and when I asked why, all I got was, "Because we want to." Personally, I've never been into the idea of gender reveals. My husband agreed, so I told my mom no. To offer something small, I said we could add pink filters to the ultrasound photos, but that wasn't good enough for her. Without telling me, my mom started planning a full gender reveal anyway. She picked a weekend when I was supposed to visit and organized a virtual party, complete with pink decorations. I only found out because my dad mentioned it in passing. When I confronted her, she insisted she was compromising by making it virtual instead of in person. I tried to explain that this wasn't a matter of compromise, it just wasn't something I wanted at all, but she wouldn't listen. From there, the pressure got worse. My mom, my brothers, even my dad, all hounded my husband and me to just go along with it. My dad actually asked me to do it to keep the peace. After weeks of fighting about it, my mom came to me acting meek, like she suddenly understood. She said she respected that I didn't want to party, but had bought some pink poppers on sale. She asked if, when we visited, we could just pop them and take a few photos with my husband, my dad, and my brothers. The way she asked was so different from how she had been before that I felt caught off guard. I finally agreed, figuring a couple of silly pictures wouldn't hurt. Then, a week before the visit, my phone blew up with calls and texts congratulating me on having a baby girl. My husband and I had only shared the news with immediate family at that point, since I had previously suffered a late miscarriage and wanted to be careful. Confused and upset, I checked my messages and realized what happened. My mom had thrown the gender reveal without me. She moved the date up, hosted the whole event while I was in another state, filmed it, and sent the video to everyone in my family, but not me or my husband. She didn't even include his family, even though she had their contact info. Hours later, she finally sent the video to me. In it, my brothers are breaking a piñata that bursts with pink powder. My mom can be heard proudly saying, "That's right, we're having a girl," as if it was her baby. Then everyone popped the pink poppers. Watching it, I just sat there in disbelief. When I finally got her on the phone, I asked why she went behind my back and excluded me from my own pregnancy announcement. Her response? "You didn't want the gender reveal anyway, so I don't know why you're upset." I was furious. Not only had she done exactly what I asked her not to do, but she also stole a moment that should have been mine and my husband's to share. I was so upset that I canceled my trip to visit her the following weekend and instead spent time with my husband's family. That's actually when my husband and I decided to honor his late mom by giving our daughter her middle name. Looking back now, the absurdity of my mom's behavior makes me laugh, but at the time, it was one of the most frustrating experiences of my pregnancy. That's the end of this story. It's crazy how far some people will go just to be in control of something that isn't theirs. What stood out to me is how the mom twisted it around and tried to act like she was the one being reasonable when she was the one bulldozing boundaries. The whole "we're having a girl" line in the video says it all. It wasn't about celebrating, it was about making it hers. Honestly, the fact that it ended up inspiring the name choice adds a little silver lining, but the whole reveal stunt is still one of the most over-the-top things I've heard. This next story is about a mother who became furious after her daughter chose to honor her late mother-in-law when naming her baby. When I was pregnant with my daughter 2 years ago, my husband and I had a lot of conversations about what it would mean for him to become a dad. He's the youngest of 5 kids and had been incredibly close to his mom. Sadly, she passed away suddenly when he was in his 20s, long before he had children. Out of all her grandkids, ours would be the only ones who never got to meet her. That really weighed on him. He was so excited about becoming a dad, but I could tell he was also carrying this sadness. One day, I suggested we honor his mom in some way through our baby's name. I never even got to meet her, but from everything I had heard, she was an amazing person. Her middle name stood out to me. I thought it was beautiful, and I suggested we use it for our daughter's middle name. My husband lit up at the idea, and after talking it through, we decided that's what we would do. It felt like a sweet gesture that connected our daughter to someone who meant so much to him. When we shared the idea with friends, his family, and even my extended family, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Everyone thought it was thoughtful and meaningful. But then came my mother. She absolutely lost it. She went on rants about how unfair it was, how I had slighted her, and how I was favoring my husband's mother over her, even though, again, his mom had passed away, and I had never even met her. At the time, I wasn't great at setting boundaries, so I tried to appease her. Since we were still searching for a first name, I asked her to send suggestions. She sent me a list of names, but they were not great. Names like Priscilla and Blossom, and others that just didn't flow with our last name at all. When I gently told her we wouldn't be using them, she completely blew up. She accused us of being disrespectful, claimed my husband was making the baby all about him, and even said we were ruining her experience of being a grandmother. She told me my husband had already gotten his pick twice because the baby would have both his mom's middle name and his last name. Still, I tried again to compromise. I sent her the list of first names we actually liked and told her she could pick from them, but she refused, saying none of them were good enough for her granddaughter. In the end, my husband and I made the choice ourselves. We picked one of our favorites for the first name and paired it with his mom's middle name. That didn't stop my mom. After the baby was born, she kept trying to push her own agenda. She would come back with prettier names, ones that sounded similar to the name we had chosen, but tweaked just enough to be hers. Every single conversation with her circled back to the name. It got to the point where, while I was pregnant and hormonal, I finally snapped. I told her outright that it was ridiculous for her to be jealous of a dead woman, and that if she didn't stop, she wouldn't be seeing her granddaughter. Even now, a year and a half later, she still makes little snide comments behind my back, according to my dad. But at this point, we've gone low contact with her, and I've learned how to set firm boundaries. That decision has brought me a lot of peace. The other day, we visited my mother-in-law's grave with our daughter, and while the situation still annoys me when I think about it, I've reached a place where I can laugh about it too. That's where the story ends. That whole situation says a lot about how some people can make even the smallest decision all about themselves. What stood out most to me is how it wasn't just about the name. It was about control and attention. The contrast between how thoughtful the gesture was for the husband versus how petty the mom reacted really highlights the difference in priorities. The part that made me shake my head was her saying he already got his pick twice, like passing on his last name was some kind of unfair advantage. Honestly, the way it ended, with them visiting the grave and finding peace, feels like the perfect reminder that sometimes distance really does bring clarity. This next story is about a kid who broke an iPad at a bowling alley, and a mom who tried to shift the blame onto everyone else. I was working at a bowling alley during a big tournament. Every single one of our 40 lanes was full, 6 people to a lane. At first, things were going pretty smoothly. Bowlers were focused, the crowd was manageable, and I was just bouncing between lane calls and fixing scoring issues. Then I noticed a kid sitting near the front counter. He couldn't have been more than 11 or 12. His own iPad battery had just died, and he completely lost it. He was yelling at his mom to charge it or let him use her phone, and she barely even looked up, just told him to sit down and be quiet. But instead of staying put, he started wandering around, eyes scanning the area. That's when he spotted our counter iPad. This is the one we use to handle reservations, lane assignments, and party bookings. Pretty much the most important piece of equipment behind the desk. His face lit up the second he saw it. He darted behind the counter like it was some kind of prize. I stopped him right away, crouched down a little, and told him, "Whoa, little buddy, you can't be back here." He just pointed straight at the iPad and said, "But I want it." I explained that it wasn't a toy, and he couldn't use it. He gave me an O and walked off. I figured that was the end of it. About 5 minutes later, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the side of the counter. There he was again, creeping along, trying to be sneaky. This time I used a stricter tone, telling him again he wasn't allowed. But instead of backing off, he just kept inching closer until suddenly, he grabbed the iPad and bolted. He didn't make it far. The floor was crowded with bowlers' bags, and within seconds he tripped, falling face first into the tiled eating area. The iPad hit the ground hard, and I watched in disbelief as the glass screen shattered, pieces falling out as I rushed over. The kid started bawling immediately, clutching his arm and wailing. That's when his mom stormed over, her face red and eyes wide. Instead of checking what happened, she immediately screamed at me, "How could you hurt my little pumpkin?" I tried to explain calmly that he had taken the iPad, ran off, and tripped on his own. She wasn't having it. She gave the classic, "My child is an angel and can do no wrong" speech, then demanded that we pay to replace her son's iPad. I told her that's not how it works, that he broke our equipment, and if anything, they should be responsible. She kept yelling until the head of the tournament came over to see what was happening. We both explained our sides, and thankfully he believed me. He said since it happened during his tournament, he'd cover the cost of replacing our damaged iPad. But he also made it clear the mother, her son, and the bowler they were with were all disqualified and kicked out immediately. Honestly, I felt bad for the bowler because he was doing really well. But thanks to that mom, it all went out the window. Later, I found out from the official that This wasn't the first time she caused trouble. Apparently, she had been warned at a previous tournament about her behavior and not watching her kid, and this time was the last straw. That's where the story ends. It's wild how quickly that escalated from a kid being bored to a full-blown scene. What stands out most is how the mom jumped straight to blaming everyone else, instead of just admitting her kid messed up. The part that really got me was her demanding a replacement iPad for her son, like the one he broke was somehow a gift. And honestly, I can't help but feel bad for the bowler who got caught in the middle of it all. Imagine working hard in a tournament only to be disqualified because of someone else's behavior. Situations like this just show how one person's attitude can throw off an entire event. This next story is about a cousin's fiancé who decided to interfere in something deeply personal, criticizing someone for calling their adoptive parents mom and dad. When I was just 3 years old, my life changed completely. My dad passed away in a car accident, and my mom, unable to cope, slipped into heavy drinking and eventually drug use. It reached the point where my dad's family stepped in. With the help of the courts, I was taken out of her custody, and not long after, my father's sister, my aunt, and her husband adopted me. My biological mom passed away about a year later, and from that point on, my aunt and uncle became my parents in every way that mattered. By the time I reached middle school, I started calling them mom and dad. It felt natural, and honestly, it felt right. Everyone in my family seemed fine with it, or at least no one ever questioned me about it, until this past Memorial Day weekend. We went to my grandparents' place on my mom's side of the family. They've got a big property, 2 acres, so it's the kind of spot where everyone gathers for holidays. This time, I got to meet one of my cousin's fiancés for the very first time. And let's just say she gave off a spoiled, attention-grabbing vibe. She seemed like the type who'd announce a pregnancy at someone else's wedding, if that gives you an idea. One afternoon, a group of us were sitting around a table outside. Me, my parents, my cousin, his fiancé, and his parents. Out of nowhere, she looks at me and says, "It's crazy how much you look like your mom. You look nothing like your dad." Then she turned to my dad and added, "You sure she's yours?" It landed flat, and the only sound was a couple of forced chuckles. My mom stepped in to explain, telling her how I was actually her brother's daughter, and that she and my dad had been raising me since I was little. That's when the fiancé turned back to me and said, "But you just called them mom and dad a few minutes ago." I told her, "Yeah." She pressed on with, "Why?" I was already annoyed at this point, so I said, because I can. It's what I want to call them." She wrinkled her nose and shot back, "But that's weird. They're not your mom and dad. I don't like it." At that point, I couldn't help myself. I just said, "Oh, okay. I'll make sure to write that down in my notes." The table went dead silent after that, and I excused myself to go hang out with my grandma. I figured that was the end of it, but the next morning, I walked into the kitchen and saw my mom, my grandparents, and the fiancé already in there. I walked right up, hugged my mom, and said, "Good morning, Mom." The fiancé looked straight at us and said, "I already told you I don't like it when you call them that. They're your aunt and uncle, not your parents." My grandpa didn't even hesitate. He just turned to her and said, "It's none of your business what the girl calls them. Mind your own business." After that, she didn't talk to me much for the rest of the weekend, but she kept giving me weird looks anytime we crossed paths. Honestly, I just feel bad for my cousin who has to deal with her. That's the end of this story. It's wild to me how someone could feel entitled to step into something so personal, especially when the rest of the family clearly understands and accepts it. The way the fiancé kept doubling down even after it was explained to her says a lot. What stood out most was the grandpa shutting it down so quickly. Sometimes that kind of blunt response is exactly what's needed. And honestly, the little comeback about writing it down in my notes was such a perfect way to handle that awkward moment. It's one of those situations where you can only shake your head at how unnecessary the drama was. This next story is about a neighbor's friend who kept encouraging her child to steal cookies, insisting it was teaching her to share. So this was my first time trying crumble cookies. I'd bought 4 of their giant cookies, planning to take them home and share with my brother and friends. On the way back, I sat down at one of the little picnic tables outside my condo, figured I'd enjoy the one cookie I picked out for myself, while also catching up on errands on my phone. Not long after, I noticed someone walking over. It was my neighbor's friend, who happens to be one of those entitled parents. I'd run into her once before, and it hadn't gone well. I kept my head down, eating my cookie, when I suddenly heard her say to her daughter, "Look at that, Olivia. There's 3 giant cookies in that box." Then she pointed right at me. "Why don't you go ahead and pick one out? It's important to learn how to share." Maybe this lady has learned her lesson from last time. That comment caught me off guard because the last time she was talking about was when I had 2 candy canes with me. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and my blood sugar was low. Those candy canes were literally medicine in that moment. So no, I didn't hand one over to her kid. Before I could even react, her daughter started running up to grab one of my cookies. Luckily, I was quicker. I shut the box right before she could touch it, and the look of shock on her face was almost cartoon-like. The mom let out this loud, irritated grunt and snapped at me. "Oh, come on. You don't need all those cookies." I'm trying to teach her to share when people have more than they need. Instead of engaging with her, I looked directly at the little girl and said gently, "Do you want to learn something really important?" She nodded. I explained, "You should never take food from a stranger because you don't know what's in it. What if you're allergic to something in these cookies? That could make you very sick." She nodded again, more serious this time. I went on. "Another thing to remember is that sometimes we don't always get what we want. These cookies might look good, but I promised I'd share them with the people I know, and they'd be sad if I didn't. So it's always better to ask before taking something from someone." The little girl actually smiled at me after that, said okay, and even thanked me. I told her, "Next time if you ask nicely and your mom says it's okay, I'll share a piece of candy with you, but only if it's safe for you." Meanwhile, her mom looked like she was ready to explode. She didn't say much else, just grabbed her daughter by the arm, stormed off, and disappeared into one of the nearby buildings. Honestly, the whole thing was kind of satisfying. Not only did I stop her from taking something that wasn't hers, but I actually got to teach the kid a couple of lessons her mom clearly wasn't teaching. That's where this story ends. That was one of those situations where the parent clearly wanted to create drama, but it completely backfired. What stood out to me was how quickly the kid understood once it was explained in a calm way. Meanwhile, the mom just looked worse the angrier she got. It's funny how sometimes the best move isn't to argue back, but to just redirect the focus. And honestly, the mental image of her storming off while her kids smiled politely is what makes this whole story stick. This next story is about a dad who tried to use his child's disability as an excuse to let his kids run wild, only to end up getting called out by the cafe staff. Every Sunday, I have this little routine. I go to the same bubble tea shop, order a drink, and sit in the same corner tucked into the wall. It's my quiet spot, away from all the noise of the cafe, and it helps me reset for the week. Because of my OCD and being on the autism spectrum, little rituals like this are a big deal for me. If I miss it, my whole sense of time and rhythm for the week gets messed up. Most weeks that corner is taken, so I just sit somewhere else until it frees up. But on this particular Sunday, the spot was actually open. I slid right into it, already feeling some relief. A man across the room gave me a death stare, but I ignored him and pulled out my tablet to get some schoolwork done. His 2 kids, though, were running wild, tossing balloons, making noise, basically treating the cafe like a playground. Not long after, the little girl, maybe 7 years old, crawled right into my quiet corner with her balloon. She was loud, bouncing around, and had zero sense of personal space. I didn't want to scare her, so I just kind of froze and stared until she wandered off. A few minutes later, she came back, this time with her brother. He seemed about the same age, and something about the way he moved and how he was dressed made me think he might be special needs too. Again, they started crawling around near my tablet, nearly stepping on it. I tried to be polite and said, "Excuse me?" But they didn't listen. Eventually, they ran back to their dad. A moment later, he marched over with both kids and told me I should let them play there because there's enough space. I explained that my tablet was right there, and I needed quiet to focus. That's when he hit me with, "Well, my son is autistic." I told him calmly, "I'm autistic too, and I need my peace and quiet." Instead of backing off, he started arguing, saying I was clearly less autistic than his son, whatever that's supposed to mean. At that point, I snapped a little and told him flat out that it wasn't a competition, and that using his kid's disability as an excuse for bad behavior was just terrible parenting. His kids could still have fun. They just didn't need to be crawling all over me to do it. He didn't like that and tried to escalate by calling over a barista, hoping she'd take his side. But since I'm a regular, the staff already knew me. The barista looked at him and basically told him to get his kids under control, or they'd all be asked to leave. He stormed back to his seat, defeated, while I went back to my drink and my work. It was instant karma, but the nerve of him to try to downplay my disability just so his kids could be disruptive was wild to me. That's the end of the story. What stood out the most here is how the dad turned it into some weird competition instead of just parenting his kids. Like, nobody's disability should be used as a free pass to bother others. I also thought it was pretty great that the cafe staff stepped in right away, instead of letting him spin the story. Sometimes people expose their own entitlement without even realizing it. This next story is about a dad who tried to pass off his 11-year-old daughter as 13 so she could act as the legal guardian of her siblings at a fitness center. I was managing the front desk one evening at our fitness center, which is attached to a hotel. It was a pretty normal night, nothing unusual, until I noticed a kid walk straight through the lobby like she owned the place. It was Lily, the daughter of one of our most difficult regulars, Mr. Thompson. She couldn't have been more than 11, but she walked confidently, heading toward the back of the building without even glancing at the desk. I stopped her and asked where her dad was. She froze, just stood there staring like her brain had hit pause. I'd met her before, and I knew her dad well enough to remember the time he casually asked me if I babysit, then told me all about his 3 kids. So I knew she wasn't supposed to be wandering around unsupervised. Not even a minute later, her dad strolled in, cool as ever, pretending the rules didn't exist. I told Lily to go back to him, since children had to be supervised. She didn't budge, just stood in place. When I reminded Mr. Thompson of the rule, he shrugged and asked, "Even if they're just near the locker rooms?" I told him yes. Supervision means supervision, no matter the spot. That's when he hit me with, well, Lily's 13. She can watch them. Just like that, his 11-year-old magically aged up to 13 and suddenly became a qualified guardian. The problem is, I remembered him telling me just a few months back that Lily was 11. So I pointed out that supervision requires someone over 18, not a kid who just finished elementary school. He didn't like that, so he asked to see the policy. As I pulled out the paperwork, he muttered that something else must be going on here. At that point, I told him straight up, we'd had multiple reports about him in the past, and I stepped in because I didn't want my team dealing with it again. To jog his memory, I reminded him of a few highlights, like the time his kids were running wild on the track and using equipment, and he argued that the hydro massage chairs weren't really equipment, or when he refused to sign liability waivers for his kids but still wanted them using the facility anyway. Back in the present, I checked if Lily was even on his account. She wasn't. I told him even if she was 13, she'd either need to be officially added or pay a guest fee. He tried one last loophole, asking if his kids could just sit in the cafe. I explained again. The cafe is still part of the facility, and the rule doesn't change. Before he could argue more, Lily grabbed his arm and pulled him out of the lobby. The whole time, she didn't say a single word. She just stared at the floor, clearly embarrassed and wishing she could disappear. It was obvious she knew her dad was lying, and the way she dragged him out said more than anything else could. That's where the story ends. What stuck with me most here is how the daughter reacted. She didn't say a word, but you could tell she was embarrassed and tired of being put in those situations. It's one thing when an adult acts entitled, but dragging your kid into it just feels rough. I also thought it was wild how the dad kept inventing loopholes, like suddenly making the cafe its own universe where rules don't apply. Honestly, the patience it must take to deal with that guy on a regular basis is impressive. Sometimes the way kids handle these moments is more mature than the parents themselves. This next story is about a son who uncovered years of hidden family secrets after learning the truth about his biological father. Growing up, I always knew the man raising me wasn't my biological father. It wasn't some shocking revelation. Mom had told me from the start. The story she gave me was simple. My biological father didn't want to be a dad and walked away as soon as he found out she was pregnant. It stung, but I told myself it didn't matter because the dad I had loved me, and that was enough. Things changed when I was about 12. I started struggling with some health issues, and doctors kept asking for family medical history. That's when the gap in my background started to matter. Mom said she reached out to my bio father, but According to her, he refused to help. She told me he didn't care if I was sick or not, and that hit me hard. I'd get upset sometimes thinking about it, and my dad, the one who raised me, was the person who comforted me. He would sit with me and reassure me, saying I wasn't less loved just because of that missing piece. Still, every time I had to explain to a new doctor that half my medical history was blank, it reminded me of how little my biological father supposedly cared. Fast forward a few years, and my aunt, mom's sister, pulled me aside. She told me that maybe things weren't exactly what they seemed, and that I should consider searching for answers myself. She wouldn't say more, but her words stuck with me. So eventually, I did a DNA test through 23andMe. The results connected me to a paternal aunt, and suddenly the story I'd been told all my life began to unravel. My aunt was shocked to learn about me. She insisted that her brother, my biological father, had no idea I even existed. She helped bridge the gap, setting up contact, and eventually, I met him face to face. When we met, he already had medical information ready for me. He told me my condition was something inherited from his side, and he said he would even be a donor if I ever needed one. He apologized over and over, swearing that he had never been told about me. He explained that he and my mom broke up because she cheated on him, and then he never heard from her again. Hearing all this was overwhelming, but the medical info alone was life-changing for my treatment. Eventually, I confronted my mom. At first, she tried to double down, saying it was all lies. When I pressed, she admitted the truth. She lied so she could build a normal family with my dad. She said she never told my bio father, even when I got sick, because she wanted to keep things the way they were. It broke something in me, and it broke something in my dad, too. He was furious that she had lied to him for their entire marriage and denied me the chance to know my biological father. He felt like she'd made him part of the lie against his will, and on top of that, she'd put my health at risk by withholding important information. Now, my parents' marriage is over. Dad has moved out and filed for divorce. My relationship with mom is basically ruined. And my siblings, they blame me for the fallout, even though all I did was search for the truth. That's where the story ends. What gets me about this one is how long a single lie managed to ripple through everyone's lives. It's not just the health piece, though that's huge. It's the trust that shattered once the truth came out. And it's tough because the dad who raised him clearly cared, but now he's left carrying the weight of a secret he never agreed to. This next story is about a stepdad who tricked his stepson out of a laptop, only to later get tricked himself in a much bigger way, involving his car. About 13 years ago, I was in my late teens, living on my own and really struggling financially. I didn't have much, but one of the few things I owned was an old laptop. It stopped working properly, and while I knew my way around using computers, I wasn't great at fixing them. I tried searching online for solutions, but couldn't figure it out. So, I asked my stepdad to take a look. He fiddled with it for a minute, then shrugged and told me it was broken beyond repair. He added that if I didn't want it, he'd take it off my hands. Since I thought it was useless, I said sure. 10 minutes later, I walked back into the room, and there he was, using the laptop like nothing had been wrong. I asked if he fixed it, and he just smirked and said, "Yeah, thanks for the laptop." I was furious. My mom refused to get involved, and his only excuse was that he'd done a quick internet search to find the fix, implying I could have done the same. Keep in mind, I was broke at the time, and he already had both a PC and another laptop. Losing one of my only possessions like that stung. Months later, I went to visit my mom and stepdad. That's when an idea hit me. I might not know much about repairing computers, but when it came to cars, especially Audis, I was confident. My stepdad had a 2001 Audi A3, and I decided to get a little creative. Before going inside, I slid under his car and quickly unplugged the oil level sensor and a vacuum line for the turbo. Later, when he went to start the car, the dashboard lit up with oil warning lights, and the turbo wouldn't boost. He turned it off right away, looking worried. I strolled out casually and asked what was wrong. He muttered that it looked like catastrophic turbo failure, or maybe even full engine failure. He'd already spent quite a bit on repairs and didn't want to sink more money into it. He told my mom he was thinking of cutting his losses and scrapping the car. I asked him what a scrapyard would give for it, and he said about 100 pounds. That's when I graciously offered him 120 pounds to take it off his hands. I played it off like I might just part it out. He agreed, signed over the logbook, wrote me a receipt, and handed over the keys. I walked outside, lifted the hood, pulled out my phone to pretend I was searching something, then slipped back under the car. I reconnected the vacuum line and the oil sensor, hopped in, and started it up. The engine purred, no warnings on the dash, turbo working perfectly. I drove it around the block, came back, and gave him a thumbs up. His jaw dropped. He was absolutely livid. All I said was, "Guess you could have found the solution too with a quick internet search." He tried to argue that it wasn't fair, that since the car was fine, I shouldn't keep it. But I reminded him how he tricked me out of my laptop and pointed out that he had already signed it over. My mom just laughed and said she wasn't getting involved. To this day, I still have that Audi. It's practically in showroom condition and runs beautifully. That's where this story ends. What gets me here is the perfect symmetry. He took a laptop with a smug, "You should have Googled it," only to lose a whole car to the exact same line. It's the kind of quiet comeback that doesn't need yelling. The irony speaks for itself. And the fact you still have the car all these years later makes it feel like the win just keeps paying off. This next story is about a wedding ruined by a brother who just couldn't stand not being the center of attention, and the revenge that followed after he crossed the line one too many times. Growing up, my younger brother Todd was always the golden child. His birth was complicated, he spent a month in the ICU, and ever since then my parents have bent over backwards for him. Abby, our sister, and I learned pretty quickly that Todd would get whatever he wanted, even if it meant we were pushed aside, and Todd thrived on it. He made a habit of stealing the spotlight at big moments, whether it was my celebrations, Abby's, or even a cousin's. It got worse when he started dating Lucy. She actually announced her pregnancy at Abby's baby shower, completely hijacking her moment. So when I got engaged to Michelle, I wanted to just elope, keep it simple. But she wanted her family there, which meant I had to invite mine. That's when Todd almost struck again. A few days before the wedding, my best man Jim spotted a jewelry store receipt slip out of Todd's pocket. When he confronted him, it turned into an argument. Jim told me what happened, and I knew immediately what Todd was planning. I pulled him aside and told him he was out as a groomsman. I wasn't going to risk him proposing at my wedding. Of course, he ran to our parents crying, and suddenly, I was the bad guy. They insisted he wouldn't do anything, but I reminded them of his history. Eventually, they made him promise he'd behave, but I still warned him. If he tried anything, he'd regret it. And sure enough, he did. During Michelle's father-daughter dance, Todd walked right over to Lucy, dropped down on one knee, and proposed in front of everyone. The whole room's attention shifted from my wife and her dad to Todd and Lucy. I was furious, but I had been ready for this. Jim and I had a plan. We'd hired a woman to act as Todd's secret side piece. She cornered him and Lucy later that night, claiming she was pregnant with his baby. Todd denied it, but when she called his phone, and I'd already tampered with it so it looked incriminating, it was game over. Lucy threw the ring back at him and stormed out in tears. Todd knew instantly I was behind it. After the honeymoon, I ignored all his calls and texts. Lucy kicked him out, tossed his stuff, and even started denying him access to their child. When he finally demanded I clear his name, I just texted back that I had no idea what he was talking about and included a screenshot of the wedding bill with a message about him owing me half. Michelle knew the whole time what I had planned and gave me the green light after Todd ruined her moment with her dad. I felt pretty satisfied, even though Abby later said I might have gone too far. That's the end of this story. Honestly, what stood out here was just how predictable Todd was. Even after being warned, he still couldn't resist stealing the spotlight. The fake side piece twist was brutal, but also kind of fitting, given how many times he'd ruined big moments before. I can see why Abby thought it was too much, but at the same time, you can only push someone so far before they snap back. This one definitely feels like years of frustration boiling over all at once. This next story is about a kid who lost money thanks to a so-called friend's petty prank, only to stumble into the ultimate payback years later in the most unexpected way. Back in middle school, right before smartphones really took off, I got my first cell phone. It was one of those slide phones with a pay-as-you-go plan that charged 10 cents for every call or text, and 25 cents for each photo sent or received. My parents gave me $100 a year to cover it, and if I went over, I had to use my own birthday or Christmas money. Because of that, I was really careful. Most of my friends were good about it too. They'd call and let it ring once so I could call back from a landline, or they'd email me or send messages over Skype. Things worked fine until 7th grade when Derek joined our group. At first we thought he was funny, but it didn't take long to realize he was just a troublemaker. He stirred up drama, manipulated people, and always played the victim when anyone called him out. Parents liked him because he could turn on the charm, but in reality, he was exhausting to be around. And unlike everyone else, he completely ignored my phone situation. He'd constantly send me dumb picture memes, even though I told him more than once that every photo cost me money. One day, he got mad at me and decided to go nuclear. He spammed me with over 100 picture messages. Most of them were just those old lolcats memes. He kept going until my balance hit 0 and my phone service shut off. I lost $40 in one day because of him. I was furious and demanded he pay me back. He just smirked and said it wasn't his problem. I went home angry and told my dad, expecting him to confront Derek's mom or maybe even take it to small claims court. But my dad told me some battles weren't worth fighting. Instead, he took me to the carrier's store. He put $50 back on the account, had them change my number, and even insisted they block Derek's number, even though they originally said it wasn't possible on that plan. He wouldn't leave until they did. I got my phone working again, but I never forgot the $40 Derek had basically stolen from me. That summer, my parents switched to a family plan with iPhones, and I finally had unlimited texting. Eventually, our whole friend group had a falling out with Derek, and he ended up leaving the school a year later. I thought that was the end of it. Fast forward years later. I'd finished college and was back home for a few months before starting a new job. One Saturday morning, I stopped by some garage sales and ended up at Derek's house. I recognized his mom right away, though I don't think she recognized me. I noticed some Pokémon napkins for sale, and when I picked them up, she mentioned how Derek had been obsessed with Pokémon his whole life. That's when I casually asked if she had any more Pokémon stuff. She shrugged and said she still had a few boxes in the attic. She let me inside to help bring them down. At first it was random junk, ornaments and old decorations. But then she opened a box absolutely packed with Pokémon games, all in their original boxes. I kept my cool on the outside, but inside, I was freaking out. Derek had always bragged about his collection back in the day. He had every mainline Pokémon game, mint condition, plus consoles, binders of cards, and tons of Lego sets. I remembered how protective he was of it, how he wouldn't even let people touch them. And now, here I was, standing in his house with his mom ready to get rid of it all. When we finished bringing everything down, there were 5 big boxes filled with games, consoles, binders of cards, and Lego sets, including old Star Wars ones that collectors go crazy for. I asked her how much, and she thought for a moment before saying $100 per box, or $400 for all 5. I told her I'd take the lot, ran to the ATM, and loaded everything into my dad's truck. I knew right away it was worth a fortune. I handed it all to my uncle, who sells collectibles on eBay. He agreed to list everything individually, only taking 10% for his trouble. We logged every single item, and the total estimated value came out around $40,000. That number felt poetic, exactly 1,000 times the $40 Derek had cost me back in middle school. By the end of the summer, most of it was sold. The check my uncle handed me was life-changing. It wiped out the rest of my student loans and even covered the down payment on a new car. After all those years, Derek's collection became my ultimate revenge. That's where the story ends. What struck me the most here was how the whole thing came full circle. Losing $40 back in middle school felt huge at the time, and years later it turned into this insane payoff. The detail that really made me laugh was Derek's mom casually unloading his mint condition collection for a few $100 when he used to guard it like treasure. It's rare to see karma work out in such a clean, almost cinematic way. This next story is about a Marina worker who caught a scammer trying to pay with counterfeit bills after thinking he got away with it the first time. Back in high school, I had a part-time job working at a marina. We sold gas for boats and even let people dock for free if they followed a couple simple rules. Most days it was a pretty easy gig, pumping fuel, checking boats in, and chatting with people heading out on the water. One day, this guy pulled up in a big boat and asked for gas. He ended up filling it with about $400 worth, which wasn't unusual for larger boats. When it came time to pay, he handed me 4 $100 bills. I didn't think twice, took the cash, and he went on his way. Everything seemed normal at the time. Fast forward a week or so, and my boss calls me in. He tells me those bills were counterfeit, fake, completely worthless. Since the guy had paid in cash, there was no trail to follow, and it looked like he'd just walked away with $400 in free fuel. I felt like an idiot for accepting the bills, and I figured that was the end of it. But about a month and a half later, this same genius comes back. He pulls up like nothing ever happened. The second I saw him, I knew who it was. Instead of tipping him off, I stayed calm and told my coworker to quietly call the police. As luck would have it, he wanted to dock his boat for about an hour. Our policy was to get the name and phone number of anyone docking, and we also asked them to leave their keys with us in case we needed to move the boat. He gave me his info, handed me the keys, and walked off like everything was fine. That's when I knew we had him. About 15 minutes later, the police showed up. My boss told me to call the guy back to the dock. I was still annoyed about losing that money the first time, so I decided to have a little fun. I called him up and said, "Hey, this is from the Marina. Looks like there's an issue with your engine. It's smoking. If you don't know boats, engines like his aren't cheap." He had a 350 horsepower Yamaha, top of the line, and the idea of engine trouble sent him sprinting back. The look on his face when he got there and saw two cops waiting for him was priceless. He tried to play dumb, acted like he had no clue what was happening, but that didn't last long. They arrested him right there on the dock, and when they searched him, they found almost $2,000 in counterfeit bills stuffed in his pockets. That's the end of this story. I like how smooth that setup was. No chasing, no yelling, just patience, timing, and the perfect excuse to get him back to his boat. The fake engine problem call might be my favorite part, because you can tell that guy probably sprinted over thinking his boat was ruined, only to run straight into handcuffs. This next story is about a family betrayal, where money, power, and control turned an already painful situation into something even worse. Not long after my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, my half-brother, who I wasn't very close with, quit his job and moved in to take care of him. The arrangement was that he'd be paid around $300 a week to help make up for his lost income. It wasn't much, but at the time it felt like the right thing to do. Somewhere along the way, things shifted. Without warning, he obtained durable power of attorney and suddenly had control over all of my dad's medical and financial decisions. My parents had always kept their finances separate, so that power applied just to my dad's side of things. Still, it gave him a lot of authority. It didn't take long for problems to show up. Several key pension documents were never filed properly, which ended up costing my dad dearly. He lost out on an $8,000 one-time payout, and his monthly pension payments were cut by $300. On top of that, about $3,000 quietly disappeared from his remaining savings. Just days later, tragedy struck. My dad passed away. When the will was read, everything, insurance money, belongings, the estate, went to my mom. Us kids were left with only sentimental items. My half-brother, who had clearly expected more, was visibly shaken when he realized he wasn't included. About a month later, we pieced together the missing money and confronted him about it. He hadn't broken the law technically, since he had power of attorney at the time, but it was still wrong. We gave him a chance to pay it back, even offering to let him make payments over 2 years. He flat out refused. From that moment, we cut contact. What he didn't know, though, was that my mom had him listed in her will. He would have inherited half of her estate, about $125,000. After what he did, I suggested she remove him. She agreed, and now I'm the sole beneficiary. So in the end, he stole $3,000, only to lose out on $125,000. That's where the story ends. What gets me here is how short-sighted that was. Trading $3,000 for the chance at 6 figures is one thing, but throwing away family trust like that is another level. The contrast between what he thought he was gaining and what he actually lost makes the whole thing almost surreal. It's wild how sometimes greed doesn't just backfire, it rewrites the future entirely. This next story is about an overbearing boss who thought he could control his employees and cut corners on pay, until one worker decided to hit back with the law. A few years back, I took a job at a towing company. Towing and car work was what I knew best, and while painting cars was starting to take a toll on my health, towing seemed like a solid option. The pay looked decent at first, but the setup was frustrating. We had to share trucks, and the boss was obsessed with controlling every little detail. He even decided exactly where we had to sit and wait for calls, claiming it gave us the best chance at business. At first, I just went along with it, but after a few months, I realized I wasn't making nearly the kind of money I should have been. One night, sitting in a parking lot where I'd been told to wait, I pulled out my phone and started researching labor laws. That's when I stumbled on something important. There's a legal difference between being waiting to be engaged and being engaged to wait. If an employer requires you to sit in a certain spot and you can't use that time freely, then legally, you're considered on the clock. That means you're owed hourly pay, not just commission. I didn't tell him what I'd found. Instead, I kept notes on all the hours I spent just sitting there, engaged to wait. Meanwhile, the boss was getting worse. He micromanaged everything, down to checking transponders in the trucks so he could call and yell if we had the air conditioning on during hot days or the heater running when it was freezing. And then he really started picking at me. Things like yelling because I left a soda can in the cup holder. That was the last straw. By then, I already had another job lined up, so I decided it was time to put my plan in motion. I asked to meet him about my final wages. I sat down in his office, explained the law, laid out my case, and told him I expected to be paid for the time I was forced to sit in those lots. He flat out refused, saying it was part of the agreement when I was hired. I didn't argue. I just took my final check, left, and made a call to the state labor board the following Monday. They were very interested. Inspectors came out, reviewed the records, and talked to the drivers still working there. And in the end, the bill for back pay was massive. He couldn't afford it. He had to sell off his trucks, his boat, and even the lot itself. The business folded. I never got everything I was owed, only a fraction. But watching him lose everything because I knew the law better than he did, that was enough satisfaction. That's the end of this story. What sticks out here is how the whole thing unraveled just from one person quietly doing their homework. It's wild how this boss thought he was untouchable, only to have it all collapse because he cut corners on something so basic. The detail about him selling off the trucks and even his boat just to cover what he owed. It's almost cinematic. Sometimes the quiet, patient kind of revenge really hits the hardest. This next story is about a college roommate conflict where one person's constant cleaning clashed with messy housemates who didn't appreciate her efforts until she found a way to follow their rules a little too literally. Back when I was in college, I rented a small house with 3 guys. We were all in our early 20s, and as the only girl in the house, I quickly became the one doing most of the cleaning. I grew up with a mom who was a clean freak, so picking up shoes left in the doorway or moving laptops off the floor just felt natural to me. But instead of being grateful, my roommates would complain that I was hiding their stuff, even though I was putting it in totally reasonable places, like the closet or on a shelf. Things got even worse when one of the guys basically let his girlfriend move in. She didn't pay rent or utilities, but she was there constantly, using our one tiny bathroom like it was hers. She showered twice a day and filled the shower with her dozens of products. Shampoo bars, conditioners, body scrubs, you name it. Cleaning around all of that was impossible. So I asked her to keep her things in his room and just bring what she needed when she showered. But apparently that was asking too much. The final verdict from the group was clear. Stop moving people's stuff. Just leave it where you found it. So I did. The next time I cleaned the shower, I didn't move her products. I sprayed everything down with scrubbing bubbles, bottles and all. Her fancy shampoo bar started dissolving, and all her other bottles turned into slippery messes. It didn't stop there. One day, a roommate's laptop cord was stretched across the living room floor. Normally I'd move it, but this time I just left it. Sure enough, I tripped, yanked the cord out, and the laptop died. Another time, the girlfriend and my roommate had shoes scattered across the rug in the living room. I needed to vacuum, so I rolled the whole rug up, with their shoes still inside. They asked me where I'd put them, and I just shrugged and said, I didn't put them anywhere. I left them where I found them. About half an hour later, when I unrolled the rug, there they were. They called me an asshole, but after that little shoe incident, things magically started changing. Suddenly, her products were neatly put away, shoes ended up in the closet, and laptops weren't left out in the middle of the floor anymore. That's where this story ends. What cracks me up here is how effective that approach was. She didn't yell, didn't fight, just followed their rules exactly. It's almost funny how fast their tune changed once they got a taste of what "leave it where you found it" really meant. Sometimes the best way to fix messy habits is to give people exactly what they asked for and let the results speak for themselves. This next story is about a customer who kept spoiling a favorite show until the comic shop employee found the perfect way to turn the tables. Back when I worked at a comic shop, we had a lot of regulars who came in every week. Over time, I got to know most of them pretty well. There was this one guy who told me he liked Stargate, and at the time I had just started rewatching it from the beginning. I mentioned to him that I'd never seen the last 3 seasons or any of the spin-offs, so I was excited to experience everything fresh. The first thing out of his mouth was a giant spoiler from the final season. I stopped him right there and said, "Whoa, no spoilers." That should have been enough, but it wasn't. Every week after that, he came in and dropped another spoiler. Sometimes it was small, sometimes it was huge, but every single time I told him not to do it, and every single time he smirked like he was enjoying it. This went on for about 2 months, until I realized he was clearly doing it on purpose. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to sit back anymore. I was going to spoil something for him. One week he came in to pick up a huge stack of comics he'd pre-ordered. I let him pay first, and then instead of bagging them up like usual, I spread them all out across the counter in front of him. What he didn't realize was that I read a ton of comics back then. In fact, I read almost every new issue from Marvel and DC the week they came out. So, I already knew exactly what happened in every single one of the comics he had just bought. I pointed to each book, one by one, and spoiled the ending, the twists, the reveals. All of it. The look on his face was priceless. He didn't know what to say. And funny enough, he never spoiled Stargate for me again after that. That's the end of this story. What makes this one so satisfying is how perfectly balanced the revenge was. He thought it was fun to ruin something you were excited about, but when it came back around to his own hobby, suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. Honestly, that little silent lesson probably worked better than any argument ever could. This next story is about a hotel guest who unleashed extreme hostility at tech support, only to face an unexpected response from hotel management. A couple of years ago, I was working at a company that mainly supported hotel Wi-Fi. Part of my role back then was handling escalated calls from guests when the regular support team couldn't resolve an issue. Around that time, a massive hurricane was tearing through Florida, and a lot of our hotels in northern Florida and Alabama were packed with people evacuating their homes. Guests were bringing all their possessions, and the hotels were stretched thin trying to accommodate everyone. One day, I got a message from our support team asking me to handle a call from one of these guests. They said he was having trouble connecting over a dozen devices to the Wi-Fi and flat out refused to cooperate with the first level techs. So I got on the phone with him. Right away, he was hostile. He gave me the whole "I know what I'm doing, I'm tech savvy" routine, dripping with arrogance. I brushed it off and spent about 30 minutes carefully walking through his setup until eventually I got every single one of his devices connected. But instead of being relieved, he was furious. He ranted nonstop about how incompetent the other employees were, and he even turned that anger on me. I don't remember every insult he threw, but one line I'll never forget was him saying, "Your techs are worthless. You should hang them from their intestines." That one stopped me cold for a second. At that point, I probably should have just ended the call, but I froze up and kept listening. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he demanded that I help him set up his Plex server. That was a hard no, not only because it was against hotel policy, but also because it could be used for illegal streaming. That's when I finally looped in my manager. Together, we called the hotel's general manager and explained the situation while keeping him on hold. She immediately joined the call, and as soon as she spoke, it was like a hammer dropping. She laid into him for the way he had treated the staff, making it crystal clear that this behavior would not be tolerated. He tried defending himself, saying it took too long to fix his issues, but she wasn't buying any of it. She told him he had 2 hours to pack up all his things and leave the property, or she would call the police. He panicked and started begging to stay, saying he had just finished dragging everything he owned into the room and there were no hotels left with space. But she didn't budge. After a final round of scolding, she told me I could disconnect the call. And that was that. The man who had spent nearly an hour cursing us out had been shut down in the most direct way possible. That story wraps up here. What really stands out to me is how fast the general manager flipped the script on him. He went from acting like the most important person in the world to begging just to keep his room. It's rare to see someone get called out and held accountable in real time like that. And honestly, It's one of the most satisfying parts of the whole story. This next story is about tenants battling a stubborn landlord who tried to shortchange them on rent disputes and deposits, only to end up losing big in court. Back in the 80s, I was a couple years out of college when I moved into a small apartment by the shore in New Jersey. The place wasn't fancy, but it worked. Every winter, there was this routine where the heat would come on late. The first few cold days were always miserable until it finally kicked in. Normally, after we told the super, the heat would come through just fine. But one year, things got really bad. By February, the heat wasn't just late, it started cutting out altogether. Inside the apartment, it was in the low 50s, and we were walking around in coats just to stay warm. We told the super, nothing. We wrote the landlord, still nothing. At that point, we checked with an attorney and learned about something called the warranty of habitability. Basically, if the place wasn't livable, we had the right to withhold rent. So, after sending another certified letter, that's what we did. Of course, the landlord filed a motion to evict us, but we responded with a Marina defense, depositing the withheld rent money with the court. When it went before a judge, he sided with us. All the rent we withheld was protected, and we kept living there because options were limited while we saved to buy a home. Fast forward 6 years later, and on our last lease, we slipped in a clause that let us break the lease with 45 days notice, just like the landlord could. We wrote it in a way that blended into the page, and sure enough, they signed it without noticing. When the time came, we gave written notice, paid rent through the 45 days, and moved out. The landlord refused to return our deposit and instead sued us for 6 months' rent. We countersued for double the deposit. This time it wasn't small claims anymore, but we went in without a lawyer. First, we had to sit through arbitration. The arbitrator told us we'd lose and should pay the remainder of the lease. We refused and waited for the judge. While we were waiting, the landlord's attorney strolled over and asked why we hadn't taken the arbitrator's advice. We showed him our lease with the 45-day clause intact. He said it had been crossed out in their copy. That's when we handed him our copy where it wasn't crossed out. His face went pale. He made a call to the landlord and came back offering to break the lease clean and return our deposit. But we pulled out a certified letter we had sent weeks before, saying we'd only accept that deal if they settled without dragging us to court. Now that we were here, we wanted double damages. In the courtroom, the judge looked over both leases, shoved ours toward their attorney and said, "This is the lease in force." Watching their lawyer pace around like a chicken with its head cut off while trying to explain himself was priceless. The judge awarded us double damages. At first, no check came. Then we learned about something called chattel execution, which meant the sheriff could actually seize property from the landlord's office to cover the judgment. We filed for it. Weeks later, a check arrived from the landlord. But a month after that, the court called us again. Turns out the sheriff had already gone to the landlord's office, confiscated equipment, and auctioned it off. The money had been sent to the court. Since we already got paid, the court said they'd just return the extra to the landlord. The best part wasn't just winning. It was knowing the landlord had to sit there in his own office, watching the sheriff cart off equipment to be sold at auction, all for trying to cheat us. That's the end of this story. What really gets me here is how the landlord's arrogance came back around in the most embarrassing way possible. Not only did they lose in court, but they had the sheriff show up and strip their office like a repo job. That's the kind of sting you don't forget. And honestly, it makes the whole thing feel like justice with a little extra flair. This next story is about a scammer who tried to cheat a seller out of thousands of dollars by keeping both the money and the product, only to have the whole scheme collapse back on him in a way that couldn't have been scripted better. A couple of years ago, I had this guy emailing me nonstop about one of my custom arcade machines. He was picky beyond belief and dragged the process out for months, but eventually, he went all in. He ordered an ultra deluxe, 4-player arcade cabinet wrapped in Star Wars graphics. The whole setup came to over $3,000, plus shipping. 5 days later, the machine arrived at his place in Melbourne. That's when I got a furious call. He said the freight company damaged it. I told him not to worry because I fully insured every shipment. I just asked him to send pictures of the damage. When I saw the photos, it was obvious. The damage was tiny. The console had shifted slightly, but it was an easy fix. I offered to send a contractor to repair it at my own expense. He refused. So I offered to have it collected, brought back to me, and give him a full refund. Again, he refused. Then I suggested paying him what I would have paid the contractor, around $250. so he could fix it himself. Still no. What he wanted was the impossible. A full refund while keeping the machine. I explained that insurance would never cover that. It would be like totaling a car for a small scratch. He didn't care. He filed a PayPal dispute claiming the item didn't arrive as described. PayPal froze my account, holding over $3,000. That's how they work. Guilty until proven innocent. I sent PayPal every transcript showing that I offered to fix it or take it back, but the buyer faked a return receipt. PayPal sided with him. Just like that, he had his money and my machine. I was furious. At one point, I almost jumped in my truck to drive the 900 kilometers to his door, but my wife convinced me to stay calm. A few days later, karma started chipping away at him. He emailed me saying the computer inside the machine had failed. I laughed at the nerve of it. Soon after, his IT guy called me about the dead hard drive. I played along and had him ship it back for warranty replacement. Now the guy had a useless shell with no computer. Without it, all he had was an oversized cabinet taking up space. Then came the fake reviews, the calls, the back and forth nonsense. He listed the machine on eBay for $1,100, claiming it was masterfully built and flawless. I recognized it instantly. Using my wife's account, I bought it. When it arrived, I intentionally made it look badly damaged and filed a dispute. Just like he did to me, I demanded a refund. He caved, refunded me in full, and let me keep the cabinet. Now I had my machine back. But the universe wasn't done. PayPal finally reviewed my case in detail. They caught his fake paperwork and his messages where he admitted trying to scam me. They refunded me the original $3,000. At this point, I had my machine back and my money. When he realized what happened, he called me in a rage. I told him it was karma and laughed him off. He begged and pleaded for me to return the money, but I donated it to charity instead. I sent him the receipt just to make sure he knew his scam ended up putting food and clothes on kids instead of lining his pockets. That's where the story ends. What I love about this one is how many twists it took before the tables finally turned. It wasn't just a quick win. It dragged out, and then everything lined up perfectly. In the end, the scammer basically funded charity with his own greed, and that's about as poetic as it gets. This next story is about a guy whose friend got ripped off by a dealership, and how digging into the paperwork uncovered bank fraud that forced the dealership to backtrack fast. Back in January of 2020, one of my friends made a really bad financial decision. He went out and bought a brand new car that he absolutely couldn't afford. His car payment alone was nearly $800 a month, and his insurance was another $400 on top of that. The problem? He only made a little over $10 an hour, working about 30 hours a week at McDonald's. His monthly income was around $1,200, so the math just didn't add up at all. He came to me for help since I used to sell cars and knew the industry pretty well. I sat down with his paperwork, going through every page. At first, nothing seemed outright illegal. It was just the usual dealer tricks. They jacked up the interest rate, tacked on overpriced warranties, and threw in add-ons. Shady, sure, but not enough to get him out of the deal. But then something clicked in my head. No bank in their right mind approves a nearly $800 car payment for someone only making $1,200 a month. It didn't make sense, so I dug deeper. And then I found it, the finance application he filled out, and the one the dealership actually submitted to the bank. On his form, he had written his real income, about $14,000 a year. On the dealer's electronic submission, they magically turned him into the general manager of McDonald's making $70,000 a year. And that's not shady anymore. That's bank fraud. So I went with my friend back to the dealership. We asked to speak to the sales manager and eventually the general manager. At first they thought I was bluffing, but I laid out the paperwork side by side, the real application and the fraudulent one they sent to the bank. There was no way to spin it. I told them flat out this was a felony, and my friend's deal was going to be unwound immediately. The GM tried to wiggle out of it, but I held my ground. When he said they had already sold my friend's trade-in, I told him that was fine. He'd just have to provide a car of equal or better value at no extra cost. He called it giving away a free car. I corrected him. It wasn't free. It was fixing their mistake. When he still pushed back, I reminded him that I could easily take everything to a consumer protection lawyer and turn this into a nightmare for his dealership and his franchise. That got his attention. After some back and forth, he finally offered an '08 Honda Civic. It had a few more miles than my friend's original trade, but It was a big step up compared to the Ford Focus he had first suggested. We agreed, the paperwork was drawn up, and the fraudulent loan was completely canceled. The dealership had to eat the loss, sell the returned car as used, and my friend walked away with a better car than the one he originally traded in. That story wraps up here. What stood out to me was how the dealership folded the second they realized they'd been caught. They knew that paperwork alone was enough to ruin them, and the guy telling the story didn't even need to yell. Just calmly showing the evidence was all it took. I also like how he pushed for the Civic instead of settling for something worse. It's rare to see someone play hardball with a dealership and actually win that cleanly. This next story is about a pair of neighbors who thought they could keep stealing gas without consequence, only to find themselves on the receiving end of a very costly lesson. Back when spring cleanup season rolled around each year, my buddy Boris and I always teamed up. We'd tackle 1 yard at a time, trimming trees, prepping garden plots, sharpening tools, and getting everything in shape. It was one of those yearly routines we actually looked forward to. The night before it was my turn, I prepped everything. Chains sharpened, mower blade ready, and mixed up fresh 2-cycle gas for the smaller equipment. I left all the cans in the shed, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, Boris showed up with coffee and biscuits, and as we sat on his tailgate, we saw my neighbors, let's call them Rocky and Bullwinkle, roll past in their beat-up Chevy Cavalier. The car was smoking like a chimney, and we joked about how they probably put oil in the tank instead of gas. But when Boris and I went to pull out the equipment, I realized all my gas cans were gone. That's when it hit me. The reason their car was smoking so badly was because they stole my gas and poured in straight 2-cycle mix. I was furious. There wasn't much I could do in that moment, so we went out, bought new cans and oil, and carried on with the cleanup. But I didn't forget. A week or two later, at a family dinner with my wife's relatives, who also happened to be Rocky and Bullwinkle's grandparents, I spotted one of my missing cans sitting by the shed. It still had the distinctive paint marks I'd put on it. When I asked the grandfather about it, he casually mentioned they'd left it there. I explained it was mine, loaded it into my truck, and that's when an idea started to form. I bought more fuel, but this time I mixed up something special: gas, diesel, and a cocktail of other oils. I filled one of my new cans with it, and made sure Rocky and Bullwinkle saw me mowing the lawn with regular gas before forgetting to put the other can away. The next day, it was gone. Later, my wife told me their car had been sputtering, smoking worse than ever, and eventually broke down on the main road. They came to me, panicked, asking for help. I told them I had a migraine and maybe I'd take a look tomorrow. They admitted the car wasn't insured, which meant when the highway patrol found it, it was impounded. It would cost them hundreds to get it back, more than the car was even worth. As luck would have it, a local pastor gave them an old Ford Taurus. I doctored up more fuel, and after a month, that engine seized too. They eventually scrapped it, bought themselves a Ford F-150 with their tax return, and even that started having smoking problems until a mechanic figured out the bad gas had ruined things. By then, they were out $1,500 in repairs. And after all that, funny enough, I've never had gas go missing again. That's where this story ends. That was such a creative way to handle it. Instead of chasing after them or getting into shouting matches, he let karma play out through a little bit of trickery. What stood out most was how the neighbors kept bouncing back with new cars, only to hit the same wall again and again. It's the kind of long game payback that feels almost poetic. This next story is about neighbors who turned their apartment into a secret lockdown party spot, keeping everyone awake while breaking the rules, until things escalated all the way to the press and the university. Back in September of 2020, I got new neighbors, 2 young women who moved into the apartment next to mine. Not long after settling in, they decided to throw a party. Normally, I wouldn't care too much, but Belgium was in full lockdown at the time, and you weren't supposed to have more than one fixed visitor. On top of that, I worked in healthcare, and not just any part of it. I had volunteered for the ad hoc COVID team, meaning I was working long shifts with sick and quarantined residents, then biking an hour each way to get home. By the time I walked in my door, I was completely drained. The last thing I needed was a wild party next door. Still, I tried to be patient. I can handle some music, some noise, that's part of city life. But this wasn't just noise. People were shouting in the hallways, things were being broken, and by 4 a.m, I had had enough. I knocked, introduced myself, and asked when they expected their 20-plus guests to leave. I also asked them to please skip the next night because I had to be up at 6 for work. They promised to quiet down and said no more parties. Of course, they partied the next night anyway, and the night after that. By the third sleepless night in a row, I was running on fumes. Every time I asked them to stop, I got the same apologies, but nothing changed. Walking into their packed apartment felt awful too, because I worked with vulnerable people who I didn't want to expose to risk. Finally, the weekend came. They went to their parents' houses, and I caught up on sleep, but I was already fed up. Over the next weeks, they didn't throw huge parties, but their apartment turned into a revolving door. The doorbell rang dozens of times a night. Drunk students came and went, yelling in the echoing hallway at all hours. I couldn't sleep on weeknights, only Friday through Sunday when they were gone. Eventually, my upstairs neighbor and I teamed up. He explained what was really happening. They were running a makeshift bar. With all the bars closed, their place in the frat house across the street became hangouts. Students bounced between the two houses all night like it was a pub crawl. We tried talking to the girls. We tried talking to the visitors. Nothing worked. Most laughed in our faces or were too drunk to listen, so we started calling the police, dozens of times. But if the girls didn't open the door, the police said they couldn't do much. We wanted a record in the system, but it was frustrating. When the police couldn't help, I turned to what I knew best, making calls. I reached out to student unions, town hall, anyone who might step in. Finally, on my neighbor's suggestion, I emailed one of the girls' dean. I kept it polite but firm, explained the situation, pointed out the illegal gatherings, and hinted that we were ready to go public since the press was already covering secret lockdown parties. The dean called me right away. Within a day, he had phoned the student and her parents. Big drama followed. When we sat down with the girls, there were tears, apologies, and a promise to do better. But instead of stopping, they just shifted their partying across the street to the frat house. The noise continued. The rules were still broken, and now the second COVID wave was hitting. My upstairs neighbor even filmed one of their parties. I posted the clip on our country's subreddit to test the waters, and people were overwhelmingly sick of students ignoring restrictions. That's when we decided it was time to go to the press and to the vice rector, who could start disciplinary action. Everything snowballed. Local news picked up the story, confirmed with police that they'd been called dozens of times, and published an article. Then national outlets ran it too, with headlines about selfish students keeping healthcare workers awake while breaking lockdown rules. Soon after, a film crew was outside our building for the evening news. To top it off, one of the frat house students actually admitted on camera that they'd been hosting illegal parties and not letting cops in. The university launched an investigation. Before the hearing, we spoke to the girls again, and because we put in a few good words, they got off lighter. 40 hours of community service and probation. The frat boys across the street got 80 hours each and had to write us letters of apology, which I admit I thoroughly enjoyed reading. After all that, things finally calmed down. A simple WhatsApp message was enough to quiet any noise for the rest of the year. That's where the story ends. What struck me the most here is how long it took before anyone actually took the situation seriously. The neighbors tried being patient, tried talking, tried calling the police, and nothing changed until the press and the university got involved. The detail about the frat boy bragging to the news crew was wild. That basically sealed their own case. Honestly, it shows how even the calmest, most tolerant people can be pushed to a breaking point when they're exhausted and disrespected night after night. This next story is about a custody battle made messier by betrayal, lies, and one clever revenge against a so-called friend. This happened over 5 years ago, and even now, it still feels like one of my proudest moments. Back then, I was dating this guy named Dan. He was in the middle of a tough custody battle with his ex, Rachel, over their little toddler. It was a stressful time, but Dan was doing his best to stay present and prove he was a good dad. We both worked at the same bar, along with a girl named Billie Jean. At first, everything seemed fine. Billie Jean had known Dan for years, and she had even worked with Rachel before. On the surface, everyone seemed civil, almost like they were all trying to keep things friendly despite the circumstances. But behind the scenes, it wasn't as civil as I thought. Billie Jean had secretly taken Rachel's side. Out of nowhere, Dan ended up with a copy of an affidavit that she had written for the custody case. I don't even remember how the paperwork fell into our hands, but I'll never forget the feeling I had reading it. Page after page, Billie Jean just flat out lied about Dan. She twisted situations, exaggerated stories, and painted him as someone he wasn't. Now, I absolutely cannot stand liars. And when it involves using a kid as leverage, that crosses a line for me. To know she was deliberately trying to sabotage his chance of being a father, just to help Rachel, made my blood boil. Dan wasn't a bad dad, not even close. And Billie Jean knew that. The thing is, Billie Jean wasn't exactly beloved by everyone. She had enemies, people I happened to know, and people who had an easy reason to go after her. One of those reasons, she had bought a car from them and wasn't paying for it. She'd been ducking them, ignoring payments, and thought she could get away with it. That's when the light bulb went off. I picked up the phone and called her enemies. I came in peace, told them I wasn't there to cause trouble, and asked if they had her address to get the car back. They didn't, but I did, and I passed it along without hesitation. It didn't take long. Billie Jean called me soon after, furious and panicked because her car had been repossessed. She was trying to piece together who could have ratted her out, and she said it could have only been two people, me or her ex, Robbie. She was so sure it had to be one of us. I'll never forget the moment. She asked me straight up, and I casually told her, I don't think it was Robbie. She snapped back, well, who would have done it then? I could barely keep it together. I held back laughter and played dumb, throwing in some over-the-top fake confusion like, oh, I don't know, that's so weird, until she finally hung up. Meanwhile, Dan was sitting next to me in the car, trying not to burst out laughing. Not long after, the pieces fell into place. Dan won shared custody of his child, which was all he ever wanted. And Billie Jean? Without her car, she couldn't make the commute to her job an hour away, so she ended up losing that too. To this day, I still wonder if she ever figured out that it was me who set that chain of events in motion. All I know is I don't like liars, and she learned the hard way not to cross that line. That's where the story ends. That one made me laugh. The timing of it all just couldn't have been better. What stood out most was how calm the response was on the phone, just playing dumb while she dug her own frustration deeper. Honestly, it's wild how fast things can flip when someone thinks they're untouchable. Sometimes the quiet moves hit the hardest. This next story is about a shady homeowners association that tried to scam a whole neighborhood until one mom decided she'd had enough. This all went down more than 5 years ago, and it's still one of those family stories we look back on with pride. When my parents first moved into our neighborhood, my older sibling was just a toddler, and I was basically a little glowworm still in diapers. Back then, there actually was a homeowners association in place. They collected money every month from residents, supposedly to handle things like snow removal and trash collection. For a while, my parents didn't think much of it. The roads were cleared in the winter, the trash got picked up, so they figured, alright, maybe the HOA is doing something. But here's the thing, they weren't. The city was the one sending out snowplows and garbage trucks. The HOA was just riding on the illusion that they were providing services. And then came the tree project. The HOA proudly announced they were going to plant new trees all over the neighborhood. Sounds nice, right? Except the company they hired just happened to be owned by the son of the head of the HOA. Total coincidence, I'm sure. That was the beginning of the end. The day the trees arrived, my grandma happened to be visiting. Now, my grandma isn't just someone who likes plants. She's a certified master gardener. So when she saw the workers unloading the saplings, she immediately knew something was wrong. Instead of digging holes or even cutting open the bags around the roots, these guys just tossed the bagged saplings straight onto the grass. Dozens of little trees lying there like sad sticks, roots still wrapped in plastic. My grandma took one look and said, "Those are gonna die if they don't get planted." And that offhand comment set something off in my mom's head. She was working full-time, raising 2 kids, juggling daycare, preschool, and babysitters, and still paying monthly fees to an HOA that couldn't even be bothered to plant a tree properly. That was it. She marched right over to the head of the HOA's house and demanded that they actually do the job they were taking money for. Instead of being embarrassed, the HOA made their second mistake. They asked if Mom wanted to join. She said yes. At the next meeting, she showed up and saw the truth. Just a handful of members, barely 5 people, all close friends or family of each other. None of them were even paying dues like the rest of the neighborhood. Every so-called contractor they hired was just another relative pocketing money. The whole thing was a family cash grab. That summer, Mom decided she was going to tear the whole thing down. She dug through years of records and paperwork, carting me along in a stroller while my sibling was at school. And she discovered something huge. Not only did the HOA provide no real services, they weren't even supposed to be in our neighborhood. Their official zone was somewhere else entirely. So, she went to work. Door to door, block after block, handing out pamphlets she'd written in both English and Spanish so every resident could understand what was happening. Pamphlets explaining that they were being scammed, that the city was already providing services, and that they didn't have to pay another cent to this bogus HOA. And she didn't stop there. She hired a lawyer. She hired an accountant. It wasn't cheap, but she was determined to protect the neighborhood. Another resident stepped in to help her sort through the evidence, though eventually they had to back out because of work. Still, Mom pressed on. By the time she walked into the courthouse, with a lawyer on one side and an accountant on the other, she had everything she needed. Proof of fraud, records of false charges, and evidence that the HOA wasn't even legally valid in our area. The judge shut them down hard. The homeowners association was dissolved, the fraudsters were exposed, and our neighborhood was finally free. That was almost 19 years ago. And since then, not a single person has dared try starting up another HOA where we live. That story wraps up here. Honestly, I love this one. What stands out is how it wasn't just luck. It was persistence. She juggled work, kids, and still found the time to dig through papers and rally the neighborhood. The image of her pushing a stroller while handing out pamphlets is just so good. And it's wild to think that one person's determination literally reshaped the whole neighborhood for decades. That's power in its most grounded form. Anyways, that's all the stories I've got for today. I hope you enjoyed listening, or even just having this on in the background. If you have any subreddit suggestions, drop them in the comments and I'll check them out. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe with notifications to never miss an upload. But thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next one.